Thank you, sir. Okay. Chair Krantz, we do have enough for a quorum if you want to get started.
Okay, thank you very much. And I would like to call to order the regular meeting of the North County Transit District for April 22nd of 2021. And I will ask Anthony Flores, the clerk of the board, to call roll.
Yes, sir. Board Member Sanchez. Let's see, she's on. I see she's on. Board Chair Krantz.
Here.
Board Member Contreras.
Present.
Board Member McNamara. Board Member Desmond. Board Member Quirt.
Here.
Board Vice Chair Edson.
Present.
Board Member Jenkins. She's on. Board Member Bapatal.
Here.
And Board Member Von Wilpert. Okay. I see Board Member McNamara joined as well.
And I see board member Sanchez and Jenkins are both with. I didn't hear them. Did you hear them, Anthony?
I did not. I see they're connected, sir.
Okay.
Jenkins is here.
Mayor Sanchez? Okay. We'll get them identified as present when they have the opportunity to speak up. And I would appreciate it now if everybody could join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And Anthony will now provide a safety briefing and review the evacuation procedures.
Yes, sir. For those here in the building, in the event of an emergency, I'll dial 911. In the event of an evacuation, please exit using the stairs. Do not use the elevators. Once clear of the building, please do not re-enter unless told to do so by emergency personnel. We have fire alarms and fire extinguishers located on each floor of this building. We also have a portable defibrillator located on the first floor and staff on hand trained on CPR procedures. That concludes my safety brief, sir.
Thank you. And Anthony, are there any oral communications regarding items not on the agenda?
There are no telephonic communications under general public communications, sir. However, we received a number of public comments. Those were sent to the board for review in advance of this meeting. They were also posted to the website for public inspection. There are 2 telephonic comments in regard to agenda item number 12. I will play those when agenda item 12 comes up on the schedule.
Okay, very good. So we're participating in this meeting via Zoom once again, and please use the hand raising function when you have something that you'd like to comment on. If I don't notice the hand raising on the Zoom, don't hesitate to raise your hands physically as well. So we will try and get all comments and go multiple rounds if people are interested and have questions about a particular item. So with that, we will move on to the minutes for the regular board meeting of March 18, 2021. And I will entertain a motion for approval of the minutes.
Chair Krantz, if I could, I just want to make a note. There was not a change to the agenda. However, there was an update to the staff report for agenda item number 11. Received the monthly intergovernmental affairs report. The title did not change. However, the background section was updated to include NCTD staff, and Townsend Public Affairs will provide the board with a presentation regarding the current status of the state and federal legislation, including transit fares and subsidies, as well as upcoming discretionary grant opportunities. The errata sheet and the updated staff report was sent to the board for the review prior to the meeting.
Okay, thank you for that. And now moving on, I would consider a motion for approval of the minutes of the regular board meeting of March 18th, 2021.
Move approval of minutes and agenda. Edson.
Jenkins, second.
Okay.
On the motion of Board Vice Chair Joel Edson, seconded by Board Member Sharon Jenkins to approve the minutes of the regular board meeting held on March 18th, 2021, and consent items 1 through 8. Board Member Bapatel, how do you vote?
Aye.
Board Member Quirk,
Yes.
Board Chair Krantz,
Yes.
Board Member McNamara,
Yes.
Board Member Sanchez,
Yes.
Board Member Desmond, Board Member Jenkins,
Yes.
sorry. Board Vice Chair Edson,
Edson, yes. I see Tara Lawson Reamer's name up rather than as supervisor today.
correct. We were notified that Supervisor Desmond was not going to make the meeting. I populated with the alternate in case.
Okay.
Board Member Contreras.
Yes.
Okay. On the combined motion of Board Vice Chair Joel Edson, seconded by Board Member Sharon Jenkins to approve the minutes of the regular board meeting held on March 18th, 2021, and consent items 1 through 8. Motion passes with all board members present voting yes, with the exception of Board Member Desmond absent.
Okay. Thank you for that. On to section C, our other business items 9 and 10. And these two have been placed on other business with possible action. Should the board have any direction, specific direction or feedback for staff? Otherwise, staff will advance the budget development within the framework of the information that has been presented. Item 9 was previously discussed at the executive committee meeting, and item 10 was reviewed at a high level as part of the budget framework presentation at the Performance Administration and Finance Committee meeting. Katie Persons will take the lead on presenting item 9 with the support of our Executive Director, Matthew Tucker.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Today's presentation will cover the recommended budget guidance and strategic areas of focus for our FY 2022 operating budget. NCTD staff previously provided presentations on this year's budget process at the March Executive Committee meeting and on the draft service implementation plan at the April Marketing, Service Planning, and Business Development Committee meeting. What's to come aside from today's presentation is the draft operating budget, which will be presented at the Performance Administration and Finance Committee meeting in May. And ultimately, the proposed FY 2022 operating budget will be considered for adoption at the June Board of Directors meeting. Before we get into the specific budget guidance areas, we wanted to highlight some of the focus areas within the industry, as well as key considerations. Oh, sorry. Technical issues. All right. Here we go. So back to this slide. We wanted to highlight some of the focus areas within the industry, as well as some of the key considerations that we'll look at when developing the operating budget. Each of the items on this slide could be a presentation on their own, but will be a bit more brief today. These concepts aren't all necessarily related to COVID-19, but they have been sort of refocused and reprioritized as we look at mobility with a new post-COVID-19 lens. First, we want to be conscious of and attentive to the different commuting patterns and consumer behavior as our region slowly returns to normalcy. Next, we want to identify opportunities for mobility network integration with the broader community, as well as integration with new types of mobility services and amenities. Third, many transit agencies, and especially those within the state, are working towards electrifying our bus fleets, which is an important component of NCTD's capital improvement program. And last, as we're navigating these new and emerging technologies in the transportation sector, especially those that rely on smartphones and internet access, we want to make sure that we're constantly mindful of making our network accessible and equitable to all users. And that includes, of course, the appropriate state and federal regulations that we abide by, but also making sure that accessibility and social equity continue to be a key component of our decision-making processes. In the last year, we have been inundated with all sorts of COVID-19 related reports, and there's still a great degree of uncertainty about what key post-COVID-19 trends will shape our future and what possible outcomes there are for the future of work and public health and consumer behavior. We want to make sure that over the next year, we're positioning NCTD appropriately in the broader mobility landscape and keeping an eye on these evolving trends. To do that, we need to make sure that our business intelligence framework is robust and up to date. So there are 4 key information categories that we want to have in our arsenal as we navigate this new environment. That includes COVID-19 consumer data and economic indicators, industry-specific resources, NCTD service statistics and those of our peers in the industry, and localized insights in the form of direct community engagement. Now, boiled down to those 4 categories, it may not seem like much, but there really is an overwhelming amount of emerging data, and we want to make sure that we're navigating this information in the most effective way. What we're specifically missing and hoping to gather over the next year are those localized insights that will help inform our recovery strategy. So using the data in the previous slide as our baseline, we have a framework for putting this information to use. We want to make sure that we have an accurate representation of our customers and ensure that their needs are reflected in our planning process. Using feedback from our stakeholders and customers, we will develop and test project proposals to determine their efficacy. And finally, we want to generate a common understanding of what success looks like for NCTD and the broader community. So these next 2 slides have a couple of snapshots of our rider demographics pre-COVID-19, and this is an area we'll specifically be looking to update this fiscal year. In October 2019, NCTD's consultant team conducted an intercept survey at several stations and transit centers throughout our service area. Of the respondents who provided their income information, 47% had a total household income of less than $30,000. Breaking that out further, 65% of that segment had an annual household income of less than $15,000. So in total, about 30% of respondents had an annual household income of less than $14,000.
Katie, do you know what the sample size of the was? What are these numbers?
So for our intercept survey, yes, we had 1,200 total respondents and just over 600 provided income data.
Thank you.
Another good resource that we have is Sandag's onboard survey, which is generally conducted every 5 years. Unfortunately, the 2020 survey was disrupted by COVID-19, but the 2015 survey still gives us a good idea of rider demographics by mode of service. Some items to note here, you can see the difference in income levels and age between Breeze and Sprinter riders compared to coaster riders. The majority of Breeze and Sprinter riders had an annual household income less than $40,000, while the majority of coaster riders had an annual household income greater than $75,000. Additionally, Breeze and Sprinter riders are more likely to walk to access transit service than coaster commuters, which highlights the importance of ensuring safe and seamless connections to services throughout our network. One last thing we'll note here is that across the 3 modes, more than 70% of riders who used transit more than 4 days per week, indicating a strong base of frequent riders. Again, these surveys are a few years old, so we're hoping to refresh our rider profiles during FY 2022 and make sure we note any substantial changes that may have occurred. So for this fiscal year, we've laid out 5 key budget guidance areas, which we'll discuss in the next couple of slides. And those include COVID-19 response and recovery, customer experience and zero delay, ridership and revenue growth, strategic capital investments and project delivery, and financial sustainability. The first key guidance area is COVID-19 response and recovery. Employee and customer safety remains the top priority for the district, especially as we gradually transition into the vaccination stage of COVID-19. Within this area in FY 2022, we want to ensure that the customer is confident in our services and our ability to provide a clean and comfortable ride. Next, we have our Zero Delay initiative as the driving force behind improving the customer experience, including a few key customer-facing improvements. That includes investing in our network foundations and key corridors to ensure that service frequency and span are meeting our customers' needs, as well as investing in new fare, information, and service technologies that make our services more intuitive and user-friendly. Building off of our Zero Delay initiative, we have two key focus points within the FY 2022 budget that are more related to NCTD's business activities. The first is the rail and facilities business model transformation, which I'm not going to discuss in detail now because that's the focus of the presentation immediately following this one. The second is our zero emission bus technology and improved maintenance performance, which emphasizes on-site technical assistance and training as the district transitions to fuel cell and battery electric buses. This area also includes the procurement of a technical services and materials management agreement that leverages technology to support improved mechanical performance on our fleet. In support of improved customer experience and ridership recovery, we want to focus on ways in which the district can create new value for the customer. Now we're a few years out from the completion of the convention center station, but with this extension, the coaster will become much more integrated into downtown San Diego and presents us with new opportunities for ridership growth. We want to make sure that we're paying attention to our commuting customers, but also identifying ways to attract new riders by offering safe and seamless transportation to special events without the hassle of parking and sitting in traffic. Next, we want to continue our momentum and advance development of key coaster and sprinter stations throughout our service area. That includes continued negotiations with Toll Brothers related to our Oceanside Transit Center redevelopment and advancements of studies for Carlsbad Village, Escondido Transit Center, and engagement with cities related to our sprinter parking lot study. Last year, we made good progress on funding a lot of our high priority capital needs, but we still have quite a ways to go. Our focus remains on state of good repair, bridge, and facility projects, as well as our strategic capacity enhancing infrastructure projects that will unlock freight and passenger capacity for the region. A major element of our capital improvement program and discretionary grant strategy is NCTD's transition to zero emission bus operations. Recently, NCTD was notified of a proposed award by the California Energy Commission to fund design and construction of a hydrogen fueling station at NCTD's West Division facility in Oceanside. That funding is anticipated to be approved at the CEC's May business meeting. And with that award, NCTD will need to deploy 25 fuel cell electric buses by March 2025. NCTD has continued to aggressively pursue funding for these buses, including a submittal last week to the Federal Transit Administration's low or no emission bus program. A few financial sustainability considerations associated with our budget development process include effective management of CARES Act and American Recovery Act funding, focus on areas where expenses can be reduced, leveraging technology investments, and the effective management of pension costs. Other considerations for the FY 2022 budget include a significant investment in market research, marketing, and communications to ensure that we have the level of detail required to make strategic business decisions. It also includes proactive monitoring of state and federal infrastructure investments and priorities, the pursuit of discretionary funds to pilot new services and complete projects, and personnel and business model changes that, again, will be discussed in the next presentation. And with that, questions?
Questions? Karina, Board Member Contreras.
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation. All this information is really illuminating. I do have some questions. I know that we've gone through demographics before, but I kind of want to dial down a little on the non-coaster writers. There's, I know we've mentioned it before, but it's pretty startling the income when we're looking at household income. Does that have at all to do with the age of the average ridership for non-coaster? I'm kind of curious if there's a little bit of a correlation there. I can't remember off the top of my head what the age breakdown looks like. So that's one of my questions.
All right, let's see if we can, okay, back to that slide. So if you go and look at each of these modes and the specific demographics that flow from it, it fits naturally in terms of the types of services that we provide. Within the context of the fixed route bus industry, the demographics that you see here are what you would see almost at every single transit agency as it relates to the demographic makeup of transit riders. So more and more the riders, a significant portion of riders who ride public transportation on the bus mode have no access to an automobile or a lower household income or a combination thereof. And so it just falls in that category that for bus system. The Sprinter is actually a blend of both the coaster and the bus demographics. And if you understand, which I'm sure you do, Board Member Contreras, the nature of the bus lines that were replaced to create the Sprinter and the emergence of Cal State San Marcos, you kind of get that blend of demographics riding. The coaster, just to provide context, was historically created to provide access to jobs originally in the downtown area between San Diego and Oceanside. And so that fits the demographic of what it was originally intended to do, was to address peak period travels to help reduce the amount of congestion on freeways. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, so I have a question in regards to the Breeze and Sprinter. Do we know, the connection between the ridership and, is this really what people are using to access job centers, or is it more for kind of regular trips to the grocery store, to the bank? I'm a little curious about that.
I believe we do have trip purpose information from Sandag's onboard survey, so we'd be able to provide that.
Yeah, and just off the top of my head, though, I know the Sprinter is heavily impacted by school ridership. I think for both Breeze and Sprinter, if you were to look at the other categories, going to work and all facets of life experience, because again, you're going to look and see a lot of folks within this who don't have access to an automobile. So we do have that pie chart, but most of these folks are transit dependent. So Karina, almost all of their trips are taken via public transportation for whatever purpose they need from a quality of life perspective.
Right. Okay. Well, just my last comment. Thank you so much for reviewing the questions that I had. My last comment is that it's going to be really a great thing what we have in store for the coaster, and having better access to downtown. That definitely is going to have increase in ridership. So I think it'll be good to see what happens there. So that way, in a sense, we could help subsidize some of the non-coaster mobility at perhaps lower fares, because it just seems when you have $15,000 or less per year, any kind of increase in fares, it really becomes a large percentage of your income. So yeah, that's pretty much all I had to say, but great report. Thank you.
And I would follow up that particular comment by pointing out that some of the improvements that are being made are benefiting freight operations, and BNSF does contribute a significant amount to the NCTD revenue stream when they run the freight rail up and down this stretch of track. So all things considered, the capital improvements to the corridor really do benefit the entire district one way or another. So there's that. Vice Chair Edson.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Katie, for the presentation, and thank you for your questions, Karina. I think another ridership boost may come as we introduce more microtransit and multimodal connections with the coaster. Right now it's on the coast. So if we can avail others to be able to use Breeze or to be able to use other microtransit that are close by, they might not be driving. If you look at the number of coaster users who walk, we want a lot more people either walking or using microtransit to access the coaster. And I totally agree that by extending to the convention center platform will be a great boost for coaster ridership as well. I had a question on slide 17 regarding COVID safety, and you don't need to pull it up. Too late. Are there any air handling improvements also included in the COVID related response and recovery?
I believe, is that related to kind of HVAC on board systems?
Yes, please.
That you're referring to. So that is something that we're looking at for both coaster, and I know on the buses we have essentially probably as strong as we can procure HVAC ventilation systems, but we do want to ratchet it up on the coaster, and we're in the process of working through to receive those updated and upgraded filters.
Okay, thank you. And then the recent funding award, hydrogen fueling dollars for the additional ZEBs. Can you remind me of that year? I was writing fast and got to 20 to don't have the end.
Oh yes, by March 2025, we'll need to deploy 25 hydrogen fuel cell electric buses.
Perfect. Okay, thank you.
Board Member Jenkins.
Yes, I have a question about the convention center. Do we see at some point coordination, MTS or wherever, Jewel was just touching on it, to take people from the convention center to other places once they get there? They may not be going to the convention center. They may not be going to Petco Park. Do we see some sort of micro transit coordination at some point in time, like we tried up here in Carlsbad?
So right now we already have a transfer agreement in place between NCTD and MTS so that folks could transfer from the coaster to the trolley to the coaster. I don't think there's any plans to create microtransit within that area. But again, if you purchase a coaster monthly fare, you can transfer to any public transit service in the region. So that already exists today.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Welcome.
All right, I see no other hands raised. So with that, we will move on to item number 10 and receive an update on the proposed new rail operations and facilities maintenance business model. Matt Tucker and Yoon Park Lynch, the CFO, will review this item.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're going to also be joined by Graham Blackwell. He's our Chief Operating Officer for Rail, and Tracy Foster. She's our Chief of Development Services, which also includes facilities. So we're going to provide a pretty robust update today relative to our proposed new rail operations and facilities maintenance business model. I'm going to try to be slow and deliberate in the communication, and I think Yoon as well, because we know some of this information is going to be pretty granular. I would say to board members, feel free to stop us as we go if you have questions or desire additional information. Anthony, can we go to the next slide? Or does, okay. All right, so just from a historical perspective, I think the board is pretty familiar with the fact that NCTD contracts for lots of services. This is a listing of our rail and facilities contracts that we've had historically. Just as a reminder, we also contract for the provision of our bus operations and maintenance services. We contracted out that service in 2010 timeframe. It's been very interesting for us in this journey of contracting out. Each time that we let award a contract, and then when it comes time to renew it, we try to take a step backwards and take a look to see what lessons we should learn going forward and incorporate those lessons into our future plans. So this is no different than what we've done historically in terms of looking at our business model and looking at what's going to be best in the best interest of the district moving forward. So as background, there's 3 contracts with Bombardier. Just to give the board a little bit of business intelligence on it, Bombardier has now been acquired by a French company called Alstom. So we have 3 contracts with Bombardier as we sit today. 16043 is related to the operations and maintenance of equipment for the coaster and sprinter services. So that's all of the services that happen with the coaster, with the exception of contract 16044, which supports major capital project activities that would be performed by the contract. So that's a separate contract. Then there's the 3rd contract for facilities and equipment maintenance services. So the discussion today is going to be around those 3 contracts. Those contracts comprise 24% of our operating budget in fiscal year 2021. All right, contract status. So both NCTD and Bombardier have been engaged in some robust discussions. We both have agreed to work collaboratively to close out the contract. We're not going to close it out prior to the end of 2023, but we are planning to close out phases and complete those phases by the end of 2023. We hope to have a final agreement in place with Bombardier over the next couple of months to govern a smooth transition of services. We are recommending a combination of insourcing of certain services while continuing to contract for the provision of rail operations and facility maintenance services in specified areas. So this is a combination. As we walk through this presentation, I'll tell you the primary impact is labor that we would be insourcing to NCTD. Now, within the world of our rail contracts, I want you guys to think about it in the context that the folks who operate the trains and who are on board the train, that's one group of people. Another group of people are the people who maintain the trains. And then another group of people who work on signals and right-of-way. And then you have the facilities workers. So as it relates to the folks who do the signals and right-of-way, we are not planning to insource those functions. So we're not planning to insource those functions, and nothing related to bus operations is insourced as a matter of this discussion. Now, the reason that we're trying to do this and believe this is the right path is enhanced accountability. We believe that we've matured as an organization, that we should take a greater role in ensuring the delivery of the services. The rail operations business is a lot different than the bus business. One of the key differences for me to note for you all is that on the bus side of the shop, the contractor provides the liability assurance associated with their operations. As it relates to the rail contract, NCTD provides that liability insurance, and the contractor is not at risk except for excluded conduct, sort of willful negligence and behavior. That is a significant risk for the district because we provide that insurance. One of the additional reasons that we see that this is an important step for the district is to foster zero-day delay in our safety culture. One of the things that we've done in furtherance of zero delay is that when we procured the new Siemens locomotives, we also separately entered into a contract with Siemens, who was the manufacturer of those equipment, for a technical services and material management agreement that would span the life of that vehicle. That technical services and material management agreements provides ongoing engineering, parts, supplies, remote and predictive analytics. And what that has done for us is remove that risk of the availability of parts and the evolution of this technology that will occur over time. So this would no longer be part of something that we would bid for. We're also planning to do this in the context of our Sprinter operations over the next couple of months, that we would let us a procurement. And as we discussed a little bit in Katie's presentation, we're planning to even implement this application on the bus side of the shop, albeit directly through the contractor. A couple of additional reasons why we see this as an important activity for us to engage in is workforce retention and development. When you think about the maintenance of equipment piece for sure, with the value of the equipment that we have, we really want to make sure that we are having qualified, experienced people who stay at NCTD for a long time. We don't want this to be something where some people are coming in for 1 year and leaving the next year, because there's a tremendous amount of effort in training those folks to maintain the very expensive equipment that we have today. And when we think about the future of purchasing zero emission trains in the future, it's going to become even more important. So that's one of the additional critical reasons. Maximizing return on investment. This is a critical one. And I think most people know I'm a champion of the contracting model that we have. But one of the things that we found is whether we bundled the service and i.e. combined it under one vendor or spread it out, there's always a little bit of the challenge of making sure that the vendors focus in on providing the services for the dollars paid. Now, as you're going to see later in this presentation, we pay Bombardier about 20% profit and overhead combined. One of the challenges we've seen with across the board, not Bombardier specifically, is that vendors also want the top line and attempt to optimize savings for things related to labor and materials. Because again, they speculate on what the costs are going to be. And so we have refined costs to a point that we know how much it's going to cost. We're taking risk out of the contracts by doing things like the technical services and material management agreement. So we think taking this next step will remove a certain level of risk for us and allow us to directly hire the staff. The last point is enhancing our focus on service delivery versus oversight. Part of this whole transition takes us from having oversight staff to staff that are going to be engaged actively in the provision of services, a little bit more hands-on. And again, that fosters that whole approach about accountability. So some of the key highlights of this is that we can actually transition the rail and facilities business model in a context-sensitive manner that supports our long-term financial health. We're going to cover this in detail in this presentation, but the fact of the matter is I'm really confident that we can demonstrate that we can insource these services and do it in a way that supports and actually advances our long-term financial health. The proposed changes, again, will support our zero delay program, making us more accountable, but also we're making significant investments to improve service. So for us, the next key steps would be, as we navigate this presentation, is incorporating this into our 5-year budget model, supporting the transition of employees and contracts and procurement activities. It's really, really important for the board to know this is a heavy lift. Every time we reprocure these services, it's a heavy lift. It's a significant cost involved. There's significant one-time costs and ongoing costs associated with reprocuring these services. And I think I must have skipped a slide. Let me go back. Is that what you were looking at me for, Anthony? So this is an important slide that I must have been too quick on the trigger. So this is the contract award from 2015. And this is really important for the board to understand. So take a look to the left and you'll see the pie chart. And the pie chart really just a breakdown of the evaluation factors that were considered in selecting a new contractor back in 2015. Take a note that you'll see that price was 15% of the total value award. So we were not out there seeking a low-cost proposal. What was interesting in this process, the way that we manage these procurements is you first score on the technical, and then you open up price. So in that evaluation process, Bombardier was the highest rated firm from a technical point of view. And in fact, if I recall correctly, their score was so high that they could have been the highest cost proposal and still won the contract. But in this particular instance, they ended up being the highest rated proposer and they had the lowest cost. That was significant. But what is important for you all to take note of is the variations in the cost proposals that were received, some essentially $200 million difference over the course of the 10 years of the contract. So you're talking about $20 million a year. Now, there are a variety of different reasons that we have that spread, from vendors' profit expectations, thought process about risk. The Sprinter vehicle creates a certain level of complexity for vendors that would require some vendors to bid up significantly higher as opposed to what Bombardier did, because Bombardier has been the only maintainer of that vehicle since it was delivered to NCTD in 2006. But the last point that I would make in terms of this particular slide is that each time we go and reprocure these services, the prices for rail rise dramatically. So if we go out to bid under the exact business model, the prices are going to be significantly more than what we pay today. So what we are doing partly is analyzing us with the current costs of the vendor against our current costs. We're not going to be doing a projection about what we believe the cost to be in the future based upon the escalation that vendors would expect. But no doubt about it, if we went back out again, we would experience a significant increase in costs. So at this point, if there are no questions for me, I'm going to advance it to Yoon, and she is going to start getting into the details of the financial considerations.
I do have a question. When we look at this presentation, have the numbers and is this based upon the complete fleet that we have procured or in the process of procuring, and the headways and such for schedules, or will that be an additional cost on top of what we're looking at and hearing about now?
Okay, good question. So Tony, I have to break it down because there's a couple of buckets. So bucket one, as it relates to maintenance of equipment, as we have those additional locomotives coming in. So those additional locomotives have already included in our technical services and material management agreement with Siemens. So those costs are already included, already contemplated. The incremental cost for the additional locomotive maintenance from going from 7 to 9 locomotives are going to be covered by SANDAG 8.1 funding.
Okay.
Now, then separately, when we increase the frequencies, those associated costs, which are going to be combination of labor, fuel, additional maintenance intervals, those costs as well are going to be funded by the 8.1 funds in Transnet. So we won't be coming back.
Got it.
Okay. So as Matt mentioned, we're currently outsourcing the purchase transportation for our rail contracts. So as you will see later on, we'll achieve cost neutrality. As a matter of fact, we'll probably realize some savings. But I just wanted to point out, as we are going into the next year budget cycle, that it's really more about a transfer of expenses from one line item to the other one. Instead of having these costs represented as purchase transportation costs, they will be shown as personnel wages and materials. So as you look at the budget presentation that we make in May, within the 5-year, you may see some increases on salaries and wages, but proportionally a decrease on purchase transportation costs. So it's pretty much a transfer cost. So we're talking about cost neutrality. So some of the personnel impacts that will occur through this transition is that NCTD's FTEs will increase from 146 to 291. That will also include enhanced administration personnel. Within the pension impacts, the coaster engineers and conductors, they are currently covered by the Railroad Retirement Pension Plan. The assumption is that they will continue to be provided through that pension plan and they will not be enrolled in CalPERS. Another change that is envisioned for the next calendar year is that effective on January 1st, 2022, we will introduce a new tier plan under CalPERS. I will provide more details about the fiscal impact on the pension in the next slides. As Matt mentioned earlier, reprocurement of other contracts will likely result in increased costs as it was demonstrated in our last procurement in 2015. We had an increase of 24% compared to where we were back before the contract reprocurement. One thing that we want to point out that is that we have been able to achieve significant savings through PTC in the last couple of years, as we have insourced a lot of the PTC activities to NCTD staff. In this pie chart, what we wanted to illustrate is what is the current breakdown of our rail operations and maintenance contract. This is reflected in fiscal year 2022 dollars. As you can see, the vast majority of the costs associated with this contract is labor. It's labor, the 52% plus the 28%. Labor are the direct operators, and the management is 20%. So as you can see, a little bit close to 3/4 of the total cost of the contract is associated with salaries and benefits. On the right side, the total cost of the contract is $22.2 million, and it includes $4 million of profit and overhead. On the right side pie chart, it's a different breakdown. It breaks down by function. As you can see, the majority of the contract, more than 50%, is associated with train operations and maintenance and equipment. And those are the functions that will be insourced through this change in business model. And on this chart, it combines kind of the pie charts from the prior slide. As you can see, train operations is the major component for the contract, and it's pretty much almost 100% labor, which you see through the blue shade. And then maintenance of equipment, which is the second largest component of the contract. It's comprised approximately 50% related to labor and 50% related to parts and materials. Under contract 16044, this is for the most part associated with capital projects. Today through this fiscal year, we have issued total task orders to Bombardier approximately of $13 million. The vast majority of those task orders are associated with Sprinter, various overhauls, as well as the overhaul for the bi-level cars. And finally, on the last contract, 16068, which is associated with the facilities contract, as you can see, the vast majority of the cost is from labor as well. That makes up 82% of the total cost. And the total contract value for fiscal year 2022 is $4.7 million. So just to summarize, as we go into the next few slides and illustrate the fiscal impact from insourcing and continue outsourcing some of the functions, I would just want to recap. In this list, you should be able to see all those functions that we intend to insource at NCTD. And on the following slide, these are the future services that will continue to be contracted out, and any fiscal impact associated with the rebid will be determined at the time when these contracts are put out to bid for future contracts. Sorry. So finally, when we look at the fiscal impact, as we mentioned earlier, for the most part, we're talking about labor costs. So within our model, we wanted to make sure that we had the same approach as we have when we develop our operating budget, which is that we are always conservative. We always make these calculations based on the worst case scenario. What that means is that we model based on full staffing for an entire year. We also assume that most people are going to take the highest benefit related to, for example, the health plan or to the 457 plan. As well, we also incorporated in the model an estimated cost for workers' comp of 1.2%. And then we also factor in the new tier for the CalPERS pension, which is the 1.25% at 67. And finally, we just wanted to point out that within the fiscal impact, we included a 20% contingency, meaning that even with minor savings, we're still able to have a 20% contingency that should be able to cover any potential unforeseen costs or any potential increased costs from the rebid of the maintenance of way and maintenance of signal contracts. And digging a little bit more into the pension plan because of the, the significance of bringing, quite a bit of new staff to NCTD. Within this chart, we wanted to point out where we are today as far as our pension plan. Currently, NCTD has a net pension liability of $41 million. That's about 72% funded. But this liability is associated with a full staffing of 1,200 employees. So covered employees include not only current employees as well, it includes as well retirees, or also include other employees that had been terminated, but potentially are still accruing benefits. So I just wanted to point out that this liability is associated with 1,200 employees and former employees at NCTD. So on this slide, we are showing the different tiers within the NCTD pension plan. As I mentioned earlier, beginning for new hires, any new hires that start on January 1st, there will be a brand new tier that will be at 1.25% at 67. That's on the last column on this table. A few things to point out is that they will have a slightly higher retirement age of 55. But most importantly is the last line item. That's the required employer contribution rate. So as you can see, we currently at NCTD, we are paying approximately 35% as a total cost of payroll for our current employees to pay for unfunded accrual liability. That unfunded accrual liability is associated with former employees or employees that had prior service with NCTD. For all these brand new employees that start on January 1st, given that they don't have vested any service, they don't really have any part on that unfunded accrual liability. So our contribution for those employees will only be currently at 8.22%. We also wanted to illustrate here, there is what's called an amortization schedule. It's pretty much a payment plan to repay down that liability for the pension plan. Under our current plan, NCTD is geared to pay off this liability by fiscal year 2043. The payments that are shown in this table do not include any future hires. This is pretty much associated with the prior liability for service earned by prior employees and retirees. So as I mentioned earlier, with these new hires, our contribution rates is a combination of both the employer of 8.22% and the current employee contribution of 7%. The insourcing of these employees will not impact the current unfunded pension liability in the short term. However, if CalPERS or the market will not be able to achieve the 7% rate of return that currently is being assumed, there could be potential some impact, but that's that we're talking about long term, and that's unknown. And if it were to impact, it will pretty much impact any pension within CalPERS and not only NCTD. So given that there's a lot of uncertainty with the future of rates or return on the market, and potentially if that discount rate were to be reduced beyond 7%, it will not only impact current employees, but as well any employees that have prior vested service. So it really makes sense that today we are proposing a new tier of pension plan that will allow us to mitigate some of those financial risks that come with providing a pension benefit. Another proposal that we also want to propose is, in addition to the insourcing of the rail operators and maintenance staff and facility staff, is to modify our current payment schedule for our pension plan. So under our current payment plan, the unfunded liability is scheduled to be paid off in 2043. However, by switching to a 15-year plan, NCTD will be able to achieve paying off this liability by 2035, as well as realizing savings of about $10.4 million if we compare one plan to the other. So kind of to recap where we are today as far as fiscal impact is concerned, in this table, it summarizes the cost of the labor that will be insourced. It includes the two major contracts for rail operations and facilities maintenance. And the total labor cost under those contracts is currently $18.8 million. And that cost includes the profit and overhead that we have to pay the contractor if we were to continue outsourcing those activities. If NCTD were to insource these employees, you can see that we can achieve a cost of $18.5 million, which includes the 20% contingency. So this $18.5 million includes $2 million of contingency that should be able to, that will allow us to cover for any potential or unforeseen costs. And as you can see on this last table, we will still get a net savings of about $300,000. So comparing the cost under the current model contracted out versus insourcing, in addition of NCT achieving a $2 million contingency, we are still able to realize a net savings of about $300,000. And summary next steps, kind of recap what we have presented in the prior slides. Matt will provide the closing arguments.
Since you said it that way. Okay, so the transition of rail and facilities can be completed and support our financial long-term health. So that 20% contingency provides capacity for us to fund unforeseen and potential costs increases for outsourced contracts. So it's we have a $2 million buffer that's included in our number, plus that additional $300,000. So we feel really confident that we are able to demonstrate cost neutrality. The proposed changes to the pension plan will support our long-term sustainability. I do want to just be proactive on the pension plan to say, because I know there was a public comment that was received, it does not change the vesting period. New employees would still vest within 5 years of hire date from NCTD. This is going to be one of the more important notes that I can make in this presentation. Under the plan that we put forth, both for this insourcing as well as the pension management strategies, by 2035, NCTD will have fully funded our pension liability, assuming status quo, and we would have completed payment on the debt payments for our sprinter, which would mean we would be debt-free as an organization. So again, significant cost savings of the $10 million of advancing the payments. We'd be able to pay off our sprinter debts at the same time, so significant benefits for the district. Again, the proposed changes supports our zero delay goal. The next key steps for us is to incorporate this work into the budget. This is just an important thing for the board to note. Time is of the essence. Based upon our discussions with Bombardier, we do need to move with a sense of urgency and advancing a transition. Just as a reminder for the board members, per board policy 11 and 19, I'm able to make changes as long as they fall within the parameters of the budget. But I view this as a significant change for the district and wanted to give the board an opportunity to give us some feedback on this matter early on. So we're counting on getting that strong feedback today so that we can move forward with confidence in terms of executing this strategy. With that, Mr. Chair, I will turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you. Board Member Quirk.
Thanks, Matt. Really appreciate the presentation here. It looks like the financials pencil out, but I just wanted to try and get a little background to your comments earlier about, if the contracts were, negotiated in a couple of years, they would be much more expensive. I guess, why are you telling us that? Are you trying to make the case even stronger that switching to the in-source model is a better financial move? Can you just provide a little context there?
Yes, sir. And I'm going to walk back.
And
Okay.
I would add to that, when you made this presentation, it made me wonder what they know that we don't know. Are we taking, is there some sort of time bomb in this rail operation stuff?
Well, very good question. So when you go back to this slide, we should have put our costs for these services prior to 2015. So we actually did an apples to apples comparison in 2015 for the board that documented the 24% increase in terms of the cost. And the fact of the matter is, Board Member Quirk, the reason that I identify that is because it's real. And it's significant, and it's just been a trend of the industry that these contracts escalate. Rail is a boutique service. Some of the services are boutique. Some of them are driven by regulatory requirements. Things like positive train control, which were new, add additional costs as you go and transition to a maintenance perspective. So the reason we share that, because factually, when we go back out to bid and to procure the additional services for facilities and signal, we have to be cognizant of the potential that the prices are going to come in higher than what we pay today. Now, on the other side of that, we've taken a lot of actions to try to mitigate some of those costs. So as it relates to signal, as an example, hopefully the board members are aware, we received a significant grant to modernize our signal system. So we have a bunch of capital projects that are going to occur over the next 3 to 5 years that's going to bring us up to the state of the art in terms of railroad signals. We would expect to realize that benefit as we go out for this next contract. We decided to start actually purchasing some of the support equipment that's needed for rail operations and maintenance, so that each time we have to reprocure this, a vendor doesn't come in and add a bunch of new costs associated with equipment that they're going to bring and then take away. So the fact of the matter is, we bring that information up just to make sure the board is aware, regardless of the strategy that we take, that there is potential for budget increases that we can't control. As it relates to Board Chair Kranz's comment, again, I will pivot back in a couple of different things. Things have changed dramatically from a regulatory point of view, and this is across our entire industry. Standards have been tightened up, expectations have been tightened up. I know for us, for example, each time we let one of these contracts, we incorporate lessons learned. Those lessons learned always come back to us with a higher price. And so it's just a trend in the industry that the prices have been going up. But you do have to understand, for example, if I were to procure 2 miles of track now versus 10 years ago, the price would have been dramatically less as opposed to my future price of steel, it's going to go up. So you have a combination of natural increases. You have some speculation that comes into it. So a vendor, for example, on the labor side is not going to take risk. So the vendor is going to mark up wages and benefits significantly and then pass that on a price because they don't want to be at risk on it. Our assumption assumes that we're going to absorb those employees at their current rates, adjusted for FY 2022, and provide an enhanced package. That's the difference. We're not speculating or carrying a risk of it because we've adopted the current costs. To provide you a little level of comfort, we did the same thing in the context of our of our operations control center dispatch, and we were able to bring that over within that context. So that's what this activity all is. Hopefully that addressed both of your questions.
Sure. And then Matt, I just have one other question. You mentioned Transnet 8.1 a couple of times, and I apologize if I've missed what this is, but it sounded like it was related to, additional engines or services. Is that somehow funding the additional operations that are related with increased runs, or I feel like I'm missing something there. So if you can clarify what Transnet 8.1 actually does with regards to this.
Yeah, and it funds the additional operating costs for services specified in the program ordinance.
Okay, and then when we get financials in the future, do we see that broken out as Transnet 8.1? I guess, how do we follow the money there?
Yeah, so what will happen in the future is Yoon in her budget line item of revenues will show a 8.1 line item and allocate those dollars to it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Welcome.
Thank you, Vice Chair Edson.
Thank you. Matt, thank you for the presentation, and Yoon as well. With regard to the pension and the cost savings, is that strictly pension or pension and OPEB?
Well, so are you relating to the $10 million that we are proposing to save by advancing the payment on the unfunded accrued liability?
Yes, and in general, talking pension, is it pension as a big term, or is it pension rolled in with OPEB? Okay,
so let me see if I can break it down, but Yoon's my subject matter expert, but she'll help me. So remember, unaccrued liability only is associated with past and current employees on our rolls. So if you look at that bottom line where you see the 35.30, that is associated with both the normal rate that we pay for active employees, plus the additional costs that we pay for the past performance of the stock market not meeting targeted trends, targeted estimates. So when we show you this last column for the new employees don't have any unaccrued liability because they haven't been here long enough, and they would have to be here 5 years to actually have any liability. So the first time we will know anything about anything will be more than five years. Does that help?
That makes sense. Thanks for that. And then with regard to paying off the pension liability by 2035, I think that that's a great goal. But I know that at council level, when we've discussed this, that we're always cautioned that CalPERS itself, we could pay it off tomorrow and there could be new debt that comes from them reworking the percentages.
Totally agree. But the difference here for us is everyone has to pay according to one of these amortization schedules. Mm-hmm. The key piece for us is that if we advance by an additional $1 million a year, we save $10 million. I'm not one who worries a lot about where we are in terms of funding for our pension funded status, because the assumption assumes that everybody's going to be able to retire at one time. That's just not going to happen. But for us, this is real money in terms of what we pay into it. And under the operating premise that all things being equal, and if they all stayed the same, you would be paid off. But we also know even if it were to go down to 6%, we still will be in a much better place in terms of funded status. But since we're subject to this as part of law, we are just looking at how do we save money? We save $10 million. And we know we can afford the $10 million because we pay this typically through budget savings that we accrue on an annual basis because of how conservatively we budget on an annual basis.
It's good to have a goal. And yes, I think that it's good to continue to pay down pension liability. So, and do whatever use whatever vehicles like changing amortization that we can to have that happen sooner and save money at the same time. Thanks.
Welcome.
Board Member Jenkins.
Thank you. I have a question about the on the page where you talked about assumes the new CalPERS pension plan benefit tier 1.25% at 67. Who makes that decision? Do the employees vote on it? Do we vote on it?
No,
how do-
no, the board, the NCTD board would have to vote to approve that
Okay.
pension tier.
Okay, and if that's considerably lower than elsewhere in the public sector, does that affect our ability to keep or bring in new employees?
So first, it does not impact any existing employee.
Correct.
So this would be forward and perspective for new employees. But let me walk you through kind of our analysis when we discuss this internally. So number one, we provide, as all of our employees are also eligible for Social Security. So they're getting that benefit of Social Security. We also provide a significant 401k match that's up to about 4% of your salary based upon the levels that you actually match. And then you would also have this pension benefit. I would put this pension benefit in context because California is a little bit of an outlier. When I worked in Virginia, the pension benefit was 1%. So I think I understand how this is different from where it has been historically within the state of California. Our concern is under any scenario that you go with is that the forward ability for agencies to be able to afford the pensions, and I know there's been significant reform from PEPRA, is that we need to mitigate some of that risk. Because if you look forward, the stock market, do I believe it's going to perform as well as it did 30 years prior for the next 30 years? I don't know. I'm a pretty optimistic guy, but I'm not that optimistic about that. So we're trying to manage the risk for the district proactively by making sure we take proactive steps in advance. When we look at the package that we're putting forward, I don't worry about from a competitive point of view that we will be missing out. The employees that would transition have no pension by and large. So when we showed that presentation and we talked about those coaster conductors and engineers, yes, they're in the federal railroad pension. But if you go and look over in the Sprinter, those folks have no pension plan today. They don't have as strong of a benefit package as NCTD provides. And that's why when we brought in-house the Operations Control Center, folks looked at that package that we have as a significant benefit for their families. So I feel confident we're not making ourselves less competitive in the future. Those employees never had pensions, and now they're going to have an opportunity to be able to come to NCTD and create a career that you can't do almost anywhere in this country. And I'm going to give an example, because this is something that we work closely with the union to create that is fairly unique. NCTD is one of the few railroads that you could actually come in and work as a train attendant, making whatever the $30,000 to $40,000 a train attendant would make, that could then leave and be trained continuously by that same employer to become a conductor and make more than $80,000, an engineer and make more than $80,000 a year. So you can now come to NCTD under this scenario, be in that same pension plan, and be able to improve your skill set and get promoted up and be able to leave with a significant life-changing salary for you and your family. So at no point do I feel as if we're harming people. We're actually creating significant opportunities for people who may not have a skill set to come into NCTD, learn a craft, and then progress upward for their family and leave the district with a 401k, with a pension and Social Security. That's not something that most folks can say that they have at the end of their retirement days.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
One aspect of this presentation that I would be interested in your comment on, Mr. Tucker, is related to what sounds like not a whole lot of choice. You talked about accelerating the transition between Bombardier and insourcing, and you know, that's because Bombardier wants out. And so we don't, if we said, we don't like the idea of insourcing, there isn't really time to pivot and bid this out to another service provider, is there?
Well, so clearly the trajectory in our conversations with Bombardier is about winding down the contract. And that's been a clearly a mutual discussion, and I know you are intimately aware of the details. It would be significantly challenged for us to try to do this within that time frame to reprocure it all. If the board said, hey, go and reprocure it all, we try to figure out how to make it work. But it wouldn't change my recommendation that it's not going to be the best alternative for the district, because I want everybody to also understand we've already had a contract with Transdev, which was the highest bidder, more than $200 million more over the course of 10 years. We already had a contract with Herzog, which I think was $100 million more over the course of the 10-year period of time. So we're pretty much familiar with those vendors. They're pretty familiar with the nature of our operations. So I don't view a scenario that's going to come into place where anybody is going to come in with a proposal that doesn't dwarf the Transdev proposal. And keep in mind, what we're talking about is real dollars here. So a $10 to $20 million baseline annual increase to this service more than doubles that budget. So in both ways, I don't ever want to say that we can't make something work, but the truth of the matter is you're absolutely right. They want to break up with us. We definitely want to break up with them. Timing is of the essence to affect the transition. There are areas that they're losing money. There are areas that we've already made transitions, like through technical services and material management agreement. And what we're trying to do is now just execute a smooth transition.
So, Lori, this was an item that was agendized so that we would possibly be able to give direction. But if the board is comfortable with these presentations that we've just received regarding the budget and this transition to insourcing these services, it doesn't sound like anybody on the board has a problem with the direction. So are we okay to just proceed, or do we want to have a vote on this? Should I ask for a motion that we proceed in these directions?
I think the board can decide to do either. The first option obviously is just that the board hasn't expressed any opposition to moving forward, but if the board wants to make a support statement, you can certainly do that as well by way of a motion.
Is there anybody on the board that would like to make a motion to that effect?
Mr. Chair, I would.
Okay, Board Member Sanchez.
Yes, thank you. I've been listening to all the questions and to the presentation, and I've always felt that employees directly hired do a better job and are better ambassadors because they are, they have a bigger investment in the place and in continuing, especially if there's an opportunity to go to train and go higher. So I actually like this direction. So I would like to go ahead and make a motion that we move forward in this and support staff's recommendation moving forward in this direction.
Thank you. Vice Chair Edson.
Yes, I mirror the sentiments of Mayor Sanchez, and I would be happy to second.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. Let's have a vote.
On the motion of Board Member Esther Sanchez, seconded by Board Vice Chair Joel Edson to support agenda item 10 as presented by staff. Board Member Babata, how do you vote?
Aye.
Board Member Quirt?
Yes.
Board Chair Krantz?
Yes.
Board Member McNamara?
Yes.
Board Member Sanchez?
Yes.
Board Member Desmond? Board Member Jenkins?
Yes.
Board Vice Chair Edson?
Yes.
Board Member Contreras?
Aye.
On the motion of Board Member Esther Sanchez, seconded by Board Vice Chair Joel Edson to support agenda item 10 as presented by staff. Motion passes with all board members present voting yes, with the exception of board member Desmond absent.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to informational items 11 and 12. The first one is to receive the monthly intergovernmental affairs report. And Richard Harmon from Townsend Public Affairs will review this item.
There we go. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Yes.
sir.
Great. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, board members. Pleasure to be here again. Richard Harmon with Townsend Public Affairs. Wanted to provide a expeditious summary here of some state updates. We have some federal updates as well that we'll cover here toward the end. And Anthony, I'll let you know when to advance the slides. Quickly, legislative timeline this year, June 15th, as always, is the deadline for budget approval. This is the first year of the legislative session, so we're looking at September 10th as the deadline to approve legislation, giving the governor 30 days until October 10th to either sign veto or not take action on that. And these are for bills that, for the most part, would take effect January 1st of 2022. Some similarities this year with the state budget and the economic outlook. A lot of the analysts who are looking at the budget still are predicting that in the coming years, a slowdown of the economy, tightening up of the state budget. However, despite COVID, the pandemic this last year, tax revenues have continued to come in fairly strong, both individual and with business taxes. So this year in the governor's January proposal, the administration is anticipating roughly 15 billion or so of what they're considering a windfall. This is after, the influx of federal funds to combat COVID and other assistance. So looking at another windfall this year, we're at sort of a tipping point now, because within the next 2 weeks, we should be able to see the governor's revised budget proposal that comes in after taxes in the spring. So over the next 2 weeks, we should get a better picture of that, whether that's a large number or not. It does present challenges as usual, with the legislature wanting to add additional funding considerations, governor needing to weigh those against what he considers the state's commitments and what they can support. He's proposing a lot of his windfall to go toward paying down sort of one-time expenses, which would minimize how much in the out years that has an impact on the state budget and deficits going forward. So we should have over the next couple of weeks a better picture of what revenues are looking like, what changes he may make to his budget proposal, and then clearly by June 15 know where the legislature is going to come down on that. So we'll continue to provide information on that. There's one piece that we will talk about relating to transit that's part of the state budget discussions, but we'll get to that in a couple slides. In terms of some of the policy discussions we're having this year, again, what we'll be covering in the next few slides are some of those COVID-19 transit impacts. There's an emphasis this year on zero emission vehicles, and has been sort of the history the last couple of years with the legislature looking at making changes to processes of housing around transit, major transit stops, what they call transit rich areas, trying to streamline environmental reviews and more ministerial reviews of housing development. So next slide, Anthony. Again, this is just for your reference, quick overview of some of the legislative timeline for the year. Next slide. I want to touch briefly on transit fares and subsidies. I think something that has been discussed by the board. I guess it's been 2 years now. There was several bills that were introduced that looked at different groups, from youth to students and others, at implementing free or reduced price transit fares. When these were all introduced a couple of years ago, there were efforts at the state to look at Transportation Development Act, state transit assistance, and looking at are there reforms in how transit is funded and wanting to have a broad stakeholder discussion about that. So for the last couple of years, they've had that discussions. And what that meant for legislation such as this was that when it was introduced 2 years ago, these didn't move forward. The policy committees in the legislature said, hey, we're having these higher level discussions. Let's hold off on advancing bills such as this until we've had discussions about subsidies, how they're paid for, what impacts they could have as part of this broader discussion. So none of those bills advanced 2 years ago or in the last session. And so far this year, nothing has been introduced on the same lines. Next slide, please. So one of the issues I know NCTD raised when these all were introduced 2 years ago was the issue of the LC top funding, the low carbon transportation operations program funding, and what impact that had on when considering subsidies. Because just the nature of the LC top funding, we were creating what we considered a quote unquote penalty for use of those funds as subsidies, because it reduced, it changed the calculation for what was a full fare. And it was sort of a penalty to actually use those funding and encourage those reduced and free passes for different demographic groups. So the point I wanted to make is, as part of those 3 bills that were introduced 2 years ago, and what is in discussion as part of any reform to how transit is funded going forward, is this last bullet on this slide, which is language that says, hey, for any of these reduced or low cost or free subsidized fares, that these are counted as full price fares for calculating ratios of revenues to operating costs. And this was a key consideration that we had raised with the Transit Association a couple of years ago. And perhaps I'll just pause there in case Mr. Tucker if you wanted to add anything on this point or save it for later before I moved on.
I would just mention, so this specific example came up for us when we were providing subsidies on the Sprinter service. And it ended up having a negative fiscal impact, a negative performance impact on fare box recovery. And so what we were seeking in this was to say that when we do provide these reduced benefits, that those dollars get counted as a customer fare. This has been discussed at the state. There's a lot of awareness of this issue. But one of the most important things for the board to consider as we move forward, and we're on track for our May presentation to the board to present some options, is that we have to understand within the current regulatory framework, what is the art of the possible without really damaging key performance metrics that have been established by the state or the federal government. So that's my comment. I just want to make sure that I shared that with you all in a practical kind of way, that without regulatory reform, there's tons of challenges with doing something like this.
Thank you. Anthony, next slide, please. So as we talked about the pandemic here over the last year and a half, there was an effort in last year's budget proposal that regulatory relief for transit agencies that was advanced by the Transit Association and stakeholders such as NCTD that provided some flexibility and relief through the current fiscal year, so ending at the end of June this year. And I have listed there some of those, including, eligible uses of LC top funds, and primarily some hold harmless provisions, reducing or eliminating penalties based on the significant impacts to transit ridership as a result of the pandemic. So this is information contained here. This is an effort we are continuing, and the district has again weighed in strong support with our legislative delegation, as well as part of the coalition with the Transit Association, to request the legislature and the governor, as part of this year's budget proposal, to continue these regulatory relief efforts for an additional 2 fiscal years, as hopefully we recover in terms of ridership and revenues post-pandemic. Next slide, please. So this is a summary of last year's budget bill. And I didn't know if Yoon had any other comments related to some of the specific impacts on the district from this last year, or not.
Yoon doesn't, but I will I will make a comment on behalf of Yoon that we've been talking about I think Vice Chair Edson was at the Sandak Transportation Committee the last time there was a discussion about the annual performance numbers. I think the board, we want to engage the board in a discussion to that would support us sending a request to Sandak to align with the state in terms of the suspension of financial penalties. Sandak has not taken any action, but we think it's important that we outline kind of some of the challenges proactively ahead of those discussions that would occur next year. But we also want to work with Sandak and ITOC to look at reform for the performance metrics, because the performance metrics that are local don't really tie into service requirements that we have to comply with. And I won't get into the details of it today, but just to mention that as we're working also at the state level and we've already received relief at the federal level, we still have some work to do at the local level.
Perfect.
Back
Thank
to
you,
you, Richard.
Yeah, thank you. Anthony, next slide, please. The next few slides are a few bills that we are currently watching. Again, this time of the legislative year is really sort of key in determining what gets advanced and what doesn't. So there's a number of bills here. I won't spend a lot of time on many of them. As I'll explain, some of them will not be moving forward. Others I have to keep watch basically every day to see if they've changed, because many of them do change and all of a sudden are on something completely different. So this is the time of year when it's kind of do or die. Are we going to move this forward? Are we going to park it for a year? Are we just going to change it up and do something different? So this first slide regarding sort of the topic of access and accommodations, we've been watching a couple along with the Transit Association related to Medi-Cal, emergency medical transportation. This has been an issue over the last, 2 to 3 years for the district, following some legislation that was enacted about 4 years ago, I believe, in terms of reimbursement and how reimbursement works for some of this transportation. So this is an issue we raised with the Transit Association about three years ago, I think, and Mr. Tucker participated in some fantastic meetings in Sacramento, and I say that a little bit tongue in cheek. As we talked about this issue, and at the time, the Transit Association understood what we were talking about, really hadn't had a chance to talk to other transit agencies on impacts. But as most things, NCTD was sort of out in front of this, and I know San Diego with MTS has come forward and had some impacts of this. So long story short, there's a couple bills that were introduced sort of on this topic area. So far, neither of them are advancing. There's about another week and a half or so, 2 weeks, in which these bills could move. At this point, it does not look like they are, but we'll continue to keep an eye on them going forward. Next slide, please, Anthony. Equipment and safety. Mr. Bloom, Assembly Bill 917 is going to extend sort of a pilot program that's done up in the Bay Area for transit districts to do video imaging of illegally parked vehicles around transit stops and stations. I believe they just amended this bill. It likely won't apply to stations anymore to look at transit stops, traffic lanes, but allow for the cameras to be able to cite vehicles. A second bill, Assembly Bill 1337, is trying to crack down on some of those folks who are doing things both on vehicles and in facilities that they shouldn't be, and where there's local law enforcement that's involved in some of those policing responsibilities, would categorize those as misdemeanors, but also allow transit agencies to prohibit those individuals. Again, this is something that's done in some transit districts around the state, but allow for prohibitions on those individuals from accessing transit vehicles and facilities in the future. Next slide, please. A couple regional issues we'd like to keep an eye on. Assemblymember Born-Horvath has a bill that's going to look at landslides and erosion in the county of San Diego. This is particularly relevant for the Del Mar Bluffs area. This bill is currently in the Assembly Committee on Appropriations. There have been concerns that this is money going directly to, one institution, applies only to San Diego County. It doesn't go through any state agency for oversight. So this is in appropriations. It's not a huge amount of money, but we'll keep an eye to see if this is something that will advance. Second bill here, Assembly Bill 302 by Mr. Ward, is something the district's been looking at since before its introduction this year. That allows MTS to continue to enter a contract for licensing and regulating transportation services as originally defined. Some of the feedback that NCDD staff had for this was ensuring that transportation services applied to those for hire services. The author did take those amendments that we suggested just to make that clarification. So this is, again, one that's already been approved by the Assembly and has moved on over to the Senate. Next slide, please. Funding programs and procedures. Again, a couple bills that very likely may not advance this year. One is by Assembly Member Davies from Laguna Niguel that would redirect some of the public transportation account loans to the high-speed rail project and repurpose them back over to the PTA. Again, this has been assigned to a committee, but does not look like they will be considering the bill this year. Similarly, Assemblymember Chen, AB 1260, would exempt from CEQA some transit projects. This one has been set for hearing. I believe it's next Tuesday or so. The Assembly Committee, I believe it's gone over to Natural Resources, is usually pretty opposed to CEQA exemptions of most types. So we'll be watching this, but again, in my opinion, not a likely chance of advancing this year. Next slide, please. To continue with funding programs and procedures, Senator Allen has SB 44 regarding environmental leadership transit projects. While this is not a CEQA exemption, this bill would do what previous bills for large sports arenas have done, which is limit the time for judicial review. So if there are legal challenges to a CEQA document, it puts a time certain, I think it's 270 days, a time certain on when those must be finalized through their court process. And SB 66, Alan, I have listed here, this is regarding autonomous vehicles. He's establishing this California Council on the Future of Transportation. I've included it here because transit will be a stakeholder that would be part of this council. So we'll be watching this also as it advances. Next slide, please. So at this point, I was, Laura Kroger in our Washington, DC office was on deck to help to participate. This is something that we added, I think, just in the last couple of weeks. And she had a conflict this evening back there at a 6:30 event that she needed to get to. So I was going to do my best to cover the next couple slides on some of the federal updates, which I think is okay because on the specific projects we're talking about as part of this, I know Katie has that as part of the upcoming slides as well. But wanted just to touch quickly, at the end of March, President Biden did unveil the first of sort of two proposals he has as sort of stimulus proposals. It's called Infrastructure Plus. I think the numbers he was talking about in this proposal are about $2.25 billion as a starting point for some of these infrastructure improvements, and again, to serve as sort of an economic stimulus in a post coronavirus world. Really some of the typical things we would expect to see here, hard infrastructure improvements, electric vehicles, still looking at housing, broadband, and some of the childcare, and there's some housing or some healthcare that I believe are part of the second proposal that have yet to come out. It's now up to Congress now to debate these and start discussing them. I know Speaker Pelosi has wanted to have something done by the July 4 timeframe this year. I think Congress is only in session for about 4 weeks between now and then, so that's pretty ambitious. But this is something they will be considering. Still a long ways to go, but as with the new president, a lot of emphasis and trying to put this forward. So we want to make sure we're on top of it with the district and monitoring everything that comes out, so we're able to take advantage of anything. Next slide, Anthony. One of the larger updates, and this is sort of what we started talking to the district here over the last month. I think it's been 10 years now since Congress had what we used to call congressionally directed spending, but more familiarly known as earmark spending, went away about 10 years ago. There was recent consensus reached, particularly in the House of Representatives, between both parties that they wanted to see these come back, that there was real value. Part of the reason folks get elected to Congress is to try to do things for their districts. And earmarks sort of had a bad name, but that there was real value in having those success. So the House formalized agreement between parties. The Senate has also reached agreement that they want to talk and advance earmarks this upcoming year. They've not advanced as quickly as the House. The House, with their various committees, have already issued requests out through members to solicit suggestions for earmarks. Different committees had different timelines, different requirements they were looking for, and even members themselves were sometimes limited in how many they were submitting. So it's been a little ad hoc, just different things for different offices. And we're still waiting for the Senate to finalize their process. But we work with the district, and I know Katie has a slide where she talks about those projects that we were submitted. And I know working particularly closely with Congressman Levin's office, who's extremely helpful on that. So I look forward, particularly in the next board meeting in our presentation, and we'll have the federal team here who will speak much more eloquently to some of the federal updates. But I think as far as this part of the presentation, that's what I had. And I know Katie had some slides. I'm happy to answer questions now or wait till the end of all of it.
Okay. Board Member Quirk.
Thank you. I just had one question. It relates to Senate Bill 66, the California Council on the Future of Transportation. It talks about autonomous electric vehicles. Is there any language in there about vehicle miles traveled and how that calculates into some of the environmental requirements for various transit and transportation initiatives?
I'm looking at the language right now. I didn't recall any. I don't see any here. A lot of that is part of what the group is meant to do, which is start looking at what are the different, what are benchmarks, what are standards, what are impacts they should be considering. So I think that will be part of the work of that council. As I look at the current language, no, it's more about the establishment, who participates, sort of what the goals are. I'll do another quick review and even talk to the author's office, but I don't see recommendations yet on vehicle miles traveled.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so Katie has a couple more slides.
Correct. Let me advance. So just a quick update on our recent funding efforts, starting with state programs. Like previously mentioned, we anticipate approval of about a $4 million award at the May California Energy Commission meeting for design and construction of a hydrogen fueling station. That station will be located at our West Division facility in Oceanside and have capacity to fuel up to 50 fuel cell electric buses. Additionally, earlier this month, we submitted our Low Carbon Transit Operations Program, or LCTOP, allocation request, which will serve as match funding for our hydrogen station construction, and we anticipate approval in July. Next, for our federal side, for the earmark process, we submitted 3 projects of varying sizes in close coordination with Congressman Mike Levin's office. That includes funding for zero emission buses, our hydrogen project, the hydrogen fueling station infrastructure project as well, and then replacement of Bridge 257.2 on the Low Sand Corridor. And then last week, we submitted a $7 million request toward the procurement of 25 hydrogen buses. And finally, our upcoming activities. It's important to note that we are a bit constrained in what projects we can pursue due to a lack of significant local match funding. However, we feel that we have adequate match funding to compete in state of good repair programs, especially for bridge replacement and rehabilitation projects. Additionally, USDOT recently released the Notice of Funding Opportunity for the RAISE program, formerly known as BUILD. We're planning to request funding for Sprinter double tracking design and pre-construction activities, which we'll submit in July. And then another program we're keeping an eye on, which hasn't been announced yet, is the FTA's Bus and Bus Facilities Program, where we intend to request funding for hydrogen fuel cell buses. And that's all I have.
Okay. Thank you for the presentations, both Richard and Katie. I see no raised hands on the Zoom. So we will receive those reports and move on to item number 12, which is a Sandag presentation on the San Diego Regional Rail Corridor Alternative Alignment and Improvements Conceptual Engineering Study. And introducing the Sandag team will be Tracy Foster, NCTD's Chief Development Officer.
Good afternoon. In September of last year, Sandag kicked off the San Diego Regional Rail Corridor Alternative Alignment and Improvements Conceptual Engineering Study. This study is a comprehensive conceptual engineering study that will identify preferred improvements that will enhance safety, reduce travel times, and increase capacity along the San Diego subdivision. Sandag's principal planner, Linda Culp, is leading this initiative. NCTD and its rail partners, BNSF and Amtrak, are participants and on the team for this project. And Linda is here with her team today to provide an overview of the work that's been accomplished over the last several months. So I will be turning it over to Linda and her team.
All right, great. Thank you, Tracy, and Chairman Kranz, members of the board. Thank you very much for the time to talk about the SD Low Sand study. With me today, a couple of co-presenters. We have Hamish Pollock-Frazier from Deutsche Bahn. They're one of our rail operations specialists on the team. And we have Mark Ramsey with the Mott McDonald tunnel specialists. And then we have a few people from our HDR team, Rob Klofsky, Robert Yates, and Kim McGee, who'll be able to answer some questions perhaps that you might have. So next slide, please. Just very quickly in terms of some study background. Next slide. Just by way of kind of a corridor overview, what this slide shows you is the Low Sand Corridor, 351 miles. It's the nation's second busiest passenger corridor. It is our only viable freight rail corridor for the San Diego region. It's the 60 miles of the southernmost miles of our Low Sand Corridor is a San Diego subdivision, and that is owned in part by NCTD and MTS. It is also part of the STRACNET, which is the Strategic Rail Corridor Network. It is important from a military standpoint. To date, we've identified over $1 billion for capital improvements along the Low Sand Corridor. Most of that money funding has gone to capacity improvements. For example, in the last 10 years, we have built and opened more than 15 miles of double track for the Low Sand Corridor in San Diego. Next slide. Tracy did a great job, sort of an overview of the study and what we expect to result from it in terms of alternative alignments, other proposed improvements, and a lot of supporting analysis. And it's all structured around, as Tracy mentioned, the three goals of reducing travel times, increasing the capacity, and enhancing the safety of the corridor. Next slide. We've been at this about 8-9 months now. The work on the left-hand part of the slide has been drafted. We've been looking at some overall corridor existing conditions. We will talk to a little bit more in a couple of slides about operational feasibility, and we have a couple of basis of design documents that will kind of guide the conceptual engineering. We focused our attention on the Del Mar and Miramar Hill areas, and specifically the realignment of the current corridor into tunnel segments. But we'll look at the entire corridor by the time we're finished with our study, and we'll look at phasing and implementation a little bit later this year. Next slide. We have a project development team. Very grateful that NCTD staff have been able to participate on that with us, as well as the other agencies that you see there. Tracy mentioned those as well. We have an executive leadership task force that is representatives from the federal, state, regional, local level. We had a meeting a week or so ago with that group and gave them a very similar presentation. And then the Sandag Board of Directors will be hearing a presentation in the middle of next month. Next slide. So one of the first kind of foundational questions that we wanted to ask in the study is it even operationally feasible to run a higher speed service along our low sand corridor, and what that would entail specifically? So at this point, I'll turn it over to Hamish and he can run through some of those details with you.
Thank you, Linda. The feasibility study for the operations of this all had four primary objectives. The first was to evaluate technology of new locomotives, that is diesel locomotives and zero emissions vehicles. Secondly, to understand how these vehicles, along with upgraded infrastructure, could benefit service by accelerating the passenger services on the corridor. And thirdly, understanding also the changes to communication systems, signaling systems and infrastructure that would be required for that, as well as, in a fourth task, understanding at a conceptual level the potential impact and design of a Sorrento Mesa branch line, which was recently outlined in the 2021 regional plan that's being put forward. Next slide, please. As a basis for assumption, this feasibility study builds off all the prior efforts that have been undergoing on this corridor. So there is Sandag's infrastructure development plan, which assumes that the majority of the corridor between the county line and San Diego is now double tracked and has been rehabilitated with the investment there. Aside from the last portion of single track, which is the Del Mar Bluffs. However, it is assumed that those are stabilized as a basis of design. And of course, the tunnels being put forward are looking to create a long-term solution to avoid those bluffs. The corridor also assumes a couple of upgrades. So there is the Del Mar event platform that has been modeled along with the San de Guido bridge. Inside one of the tunnels, we've modeled a UTC or Nobel station, and also in the San Diego area, a new airport stop. And lastly, the upgrades would also look at then bringing the corridor speeds up to 110 miles an hour. The two sets of equipment that were evaluated, or families of equipment rather, evaluated as part of the understanding how locomotives and train technology will progress, were firstly the new diesel charger locomotives, which are entering service under NCTD, and secondly, a zero emissions unit, which is yet to be defined in terms of what that exact vehicle is. The new charger locomotive, the diesel in the top row here, is got a top speed of 125 miles an hour. And depending on the service that it's pulling, the Pacific Surfliner limited stop service or the Coaster all stop service has an actual operating speed of either 110 or 90 miles an hour. And that's really down to the safety standards of the cars that locomotive is pulling. The zero emissions unit could represent a number of different solutions on the corridor. It could represent a hydrogen powered vehicle, a battery powered vehicle, or some sort of other electrified unit. And in this case, we chose the new Stadler Kiss, which is coming online for Caltrain service, as it has a top speed of 110 miles an hour. And it also represents the key performance parameters that we're looking for. That is a very good acceleration and deceleration ability for frequent stopping service. Next slide, please. On screen here is just an example of some of the tests that we've been carrying. So on screen is a speed distance diagram going from Oceanside down to San Diego. The corridor is modeled with a speed limit of 110 miles an hour, which is represented by that horizontal blue line. it passes from Oceanside through 2 new tunnel alignments, which are highlighted. Their approximate location is highlighted by the band of yellow and red. That's the Delmar Tunnel that would replace or circumnavigate the bluffs, and the Miramar Tunnel, which would of course navigate round the, or rather be a shortcut to the hill before entering into the San Diego region. The 2 other lines show the actual performance of the trains when operating at a track speed of 110 miles an hour, carrying out a coaster style service. The key things here are firstly that the red line represents the ZMU unit. You can see that it has very good acceleration capabilities due to the gradient of the curve reaching 110 miles an hour versus the green line, which is the diesel unit, where that is a charger locomotive pulling bi-level cars. On the one hand, there is the acceleration performance of the ZMU. However, when we look at longer sections of track where there is no station present, for example, between Solana Beach and the proposed UTC Nobel station, the ZMU also outperforms the diesel as it's able to sustain 110 miles an hour, whereas the diesel unit is, although capable of 125 miles an hour, limited by the safety standards for the cars. Next slide, please. This slide and the next report on the results, the preliminary results of the travel times for running higher speed locomotives and ZMU units on an upgraded alignment through the 2 tunnels. The first column, sorry, the first row rather, shows the current alignment's travel time. This is under optimal timetable conditions for an all-stop service between Oceanside and San Diego. You can see in the top right-hand corner of the screen here the stopping pattern that the trains are adhering to. The current alignment takes about 56 minutes if it had unhindered access to the corridor. And then the following results underneath it, the 90 miles an hour and 110 miles an hour for the diesel unit come in at about 43 minutes. That there is made up of a time saving of about 10 minutes due to the tunnels, and then the additional time is made up by the high performance of the new chargers and also the upgraded infrastructure. In the bottom 2 rows there for the ZMU unit running at 90 and 110 miles an hour, we get further travel time savings, and this is because the ZMU unit can accelerate to speed more quickly than the diesel unit can, and B, with the 110 mile an hour operating speed, the ZMU can reach that top speed and sustain it for a little longer, generating more travel time savings. So there is the potential with all these upgrades, the tunnels, the upgrade to the alignment, and the new vehicle solutions to reduce travel times by approximately 20 minutes. Next slide, please. This here is the results for the limited stop service, where this service here would represent the current day Pacific Surfliner, and it's again a very similar story. So the stopping pattern in the top right-hand corner follows that of what the current day Pacific Surfliner is doing, and under optimal conditions on the current alignment, the Surfliner could probably achieve that in about 48 minutes. When we run the service at a sustained speed at 90 miles an hour or 110 miles an hour with further upgrades to the alignment, again, due to the tunnels, we get a 10-minute saving. And then secondly, there are a minute or 2 in addition, just due to the further characteristics of the upgraded rolling stock and infrastructure.
Can I ask a clarifying question on this particular slide? So this slide says that assuming the new alignment, looking at the 90 mile per hour on the tunnels and the 110 mile an hour on the tunnels, there's no time savings in going 20 miles per hour more from Oceanside to Solana Beach.
That's right. This is because of the acceleration characteristics of the diesel locomotive plus the rolling stock. So the diesel locomotive certainly can reach 110 miles an hour. However, it needs a very long section of track to make that additional 20 miles an hour. So once it's past 90, the length of track just to get up to that last 100, that final 20 miles isn't sufficient, as then the train needs to decelerate and brake in time for Solana Beach. If the train was running,
even the new vehicles would show 1 minute savings between Oceanside and Solana Beach at 90 miles an hour, and 2 minutes of savings over 100 at 110 miles an hour. And so looking at the total trip, it's a 3 minute savings of time at 110 miles an hour versus 90, or 6 minutes difference at 110 for the diesel versus the ZMU. And so, okay, I just wanted to make sure I was reading this chart right to identify the total time saved. Thank you.
Board Chair France.
Yes, sir.
So just in furtherance of that discussion a little bit, because that's going to be a key piece. And I would be interested, Hamish, maybe you can tell me, or Linda, I think at this point, are you guys just analyzing this because obviously there's going to be a cost difference in infrastructure and equipment to go to from 90 to 110 miles per hour? We can take it as a given that the next generation of coaster fleet is going to be near zero or zero emissions vehicle technology. So that's going to happen no matter what. But going from a 90 miles per hour to 110 miles per hour equipment and capital infrastructure, there's a cost associated with that. So just to confirm, you guys are not saying we're doing 110 miles per hour. Are you just analyzing it, and then we're going to do the cost analysis for the differences in the infrastructure to actually achieve it, to determine if there's a cost benefit associated with going to 110 miles per hour?
And yes, at this stage, it's just to report on what the travel times are. This is just the feasibility of and getting a first understanding of what is the impact of making the upgrades to raising, for example, track speeds from 90 to 110, and what is the impact of the rolling stock. We also looked at 125 miles an hour. This isn't reported, and we viewed this with the capability, for example, of the charger, that it can reach 125 miles an hour. But again, it becomes a function of the stopping pattern in the service that begins to limit the benefit of the higher speeds. If in the future there was a non-stop express service, then that 125 mile an hour would be very beneficial for travel time savings. At this stage, we've made no analysis on the cost benefit. It's merely to report at a first level of what the travel time savings could be.
Okay. And I just wanted to clarify that for the board members. This is just the analysis from a model, because I do think from an NCTD point of view, before we could support that, we really would have to see the cost and calculate the cost benefit ratio. There are significant improvements in travel time savings. A lot of that comes from the construction of that UTC tunnel. That's a significant, I think it's 7 to 10 minutes savings end to end on the travel time. But we will await, the next stage of analysis where we actually get into cost and cost benefit analysis before we could commit to that 110 miles per hour as being a good option for the region. So back over to you.
Vice Chair Edson, did you have a question now or at the end of the presentation?
Yeah, I just have a quick question while we're here before I lose the question. Okay. So this Stadler Kiss and the Siemens Charger, can they run on the same rails? Because the photos that I see, with the little embedded Stadler Kiss has catenary lines. Are they able to run on the same rails?
So we have no plans to do a catenary based zero emission vehicle, nor does BNSF. And they just did this from a modeling point of view. I think the Stadler vehicle is going to be operated by Caltrain as part of their electrified catenary-based system. But I think this picture is just for illustrative examples. So, Jewel, just to be consistent, I think the first time you're going to see a near or zero emission vehicle is when we start the procurement process for the next Sprinter generation of vehicles. We've seen mock-ups of different vehicles. There could be the scenario that we have a battery-based vehicle or a hydrogen-based vehicle. It could be a catenary system at a terminal station, depending on the nature of the operations. But under no scenario are we planning to come back to the region to say, let's add catenary from beginning to the end of this entire corridor. We're looking at non-catenary based solutions as the next vehicle technology.
Okay, I know I raised this question before since I've seen this. This is my third time to see this presentation, but I think it's important and that other coastal communities, take a look at that and go, oh my gosh. So thank you for answering that question for the third time. And my apologies for asking it 3 times.
You're welcome.
And just to confirm, I can completely confirm Matt's point. The Stadler there was just chosen for illustrative purposes to represent a state-of-the-art vehicle. I'll come to my next slide, which is the last on my part of the presentation here. What we found is that 110 mile-an-hour operations really represents the maximum line speed you would want to design for. Going past that to 125 miles an hour, although not reported in this deck, showed no measurable benefit. And really, the 110 miles an hour really came down to the equipment you started operating on the corridor. The ZMU unit, when it comes into procurement, would offer an additional benefit over the diesel locomotives due to its acceleration and deceleration abilities. There are still some further open points that we're investigating, of course, with the freight impact and ensuring that freight operations work with 110 mile an hour passenger operations. We're still analyzing that. And the last thing maybe I'd like to mention is that although we're focusing on the San Diego subdivision from the county line through the tunnels to San Diego Depot, in conjunction, I'd encourage NCTD to also push its neighbors north of the county to also resolve the San Clemente bottleneck, because if we have a state-of-the-art bit of infrastructure on this portion of the corridor, the benefit of it won't be realized until the San Clemente constraint is also resolved. Thank you.
Thanks, Hamish. Next slide, please. Now, the next section, we would like to talk to you a little bit more about some of the alignment refinements that we have made in both the Del Mar and the Miramar Hill areas. So next slide, please. What this graphic shows you is kind of north is heading towards the left-hand side of the slide. And just right in the left-hand corner of the graphic, you can see the Del Mar Fairgrounds. And that's the San Diego Bridge, for example, crossing the river. And then we have 5 alignments that we first conceptualized a few years ago. And those are shown in the colors. We've made some recent refinements, I should say. Those are in the colors, for example, to the red line, which is a Camino Del Mar tunnel. We did, in the interest of speeding up that route, which you can see is in the black along Camino Del Mar. That's mainly meant for a road and cars, not so much a rail. So we straightened out some of those curves, and you see those in the red line now to increase the speed of that section or that alignment. We have actually 3 alignments in the Crest Canyon section, the middle section of the graphic there. 2 of them are shown in blue. One is when we get down to Carmel Valley Road, you can see kind of towards the right-hand side of the graphic. One alternative goes above Carmel Valley Road, one below. And then the yellow line is a higher speed alignment, also through Crest Canyon. And then the green is proposed for an I-5 tunnel, and you can see how those all look together, compared together. And the stars are just proposed portal locations, and you can see for each alignment. That's between those stars, in other words, would be the actual tunnel segments. Next slide. So keeping with the 5 alignments, we do have some preliminary information for each. And so the first column, you can see there is the maximum speed allowable for passenger and freight trains. So for example, today, the maximum speed on the San Diego subdivision is 90 for passengers, 60 for freight. And then you can see how we reach that 110 speed for passengers through 4 of the 5 alignments. However, that I-5 alignment, we cannot attain that 110. So it's 80 maximum speed for passenger. The middle column shows you capital cost comparison. And if we use the Camino del Mar tunnel alternative as the base, you can see at a very high level, as we know it right now, how the costs compare, with I-5 being the costliest. It's the longest, it's the costliest of our 5 alignments. And then the last section of the table shows you travel time. And we have taken a little snippet of the corridor from Solana Beach to Old Town. And right now that trip takes coaster about 31 minutes. It takes a Surfliner, the limited stop, about 32 minutes. And you can see how under the various tunnel alignments, those travel times changed, first for the charger locomotives and then for a zero emission vehicle. So you could see that, for example, under 4 of the 5 alignments for a charger scenario, going from that 31 minutes to 28 minutes. And so we've just taken out the benefit for a Del Mar tunnel. And you can see additional minutes off in terms of a zero emission. And then lastly, the last 2 columns, more limited stop service or our Surfliner service, and you can see benefits for that service as well. Next slide. One of the things we worked very closely with our project development team on is a set of evaluation criteria or technical criteria that we would use to apply to each of these 5 alternatives. And you can see them listed here. And then you can see highlighted are the ones that the project development team rated or weighted most heaviest of all. We still use all of the criteria, but you can see things like safety, travel demand and travel time, operations and maintenance costs kind of rose in terms of the weights. Next slide. So the PDT took a lot of time and went through each of the criteria and each of the alternative alignments. And we scored each one on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being the worst, 5 being the best. And you kind of draw your eye, the red, if you're getting a red bubble there, you're the lowest score. And then we compared that with the weights. When we were finished, we had a total score, and that's shown down at the bottom of the table. And so what we're recommending is that we take the highest weighted alternative of the 3 Crest Canyon alignments, as well as the Camino del Mar alignment, and we carry those into further study, realizing that Crest Canyon above Carmel Valley, that's very close in total score to a Camino del Mar. And really, if we changed one of these scores, we would change that order. But we feel like taking that highest of the 3 in Crest Canyon would be what we would want to do moving forward. Next slide. And then just to end up the Del Mar discussion is just to give you a little summary information that we know so far. And that is, we talked about cost, the length of the entire project area, and then versus the tunnel length, you can see how that differentiates between the 5 alignments. The depth, you can see some changes there in terms of below Carmel Valley Road alignment, very deep in some portions versus a Camino del Mar. And that we would, to get to and from the tunnel segments, there could be elevated structures, and that's important to keep in mind as we work on all of these alignments as we go. Next slide. So the second segment of the corridor that we've been working on is the Miramar Hill alignment, and that's shown in this graphic. And again, north is to the left-hand side of the graphic. The left-hand side is the Sereno Valley. You can see that 805 freeway there is a reference point. That's where the Sereno Valley Coaster Station is, for example. And so we looked at, and then we also painted on the future Mid-Coast Light Rail Corridor. That's also in our analysis important to have a connection to Mid-Coast, and that's shown in the orange. So we evaluated a couple of alternatives here. One is a UTC alignment that's in purple. The other is what we're calling a Torrey Pines alignment. And you can see that in blue, and you can see where the proposed portals are. If you click one more time, Anthony. A similar table to the Del Mar alignment, our base condition, again, 90 mile an hour maximum speed on the corridor for passengers, 60 for freight. However, I would note that this is the slowest segment going up Miramar Hill of all of the segments actually between San Diego and LA. And so the Torrey Pines and the UTC alignments both attain that 110 top speed for passengers, 60 for freight. Very similar in costs as we know them kind of at this high level of analysis, with UTC being slightly more. And you can see travel times, and what Matt mentioned earlier in the presentation really shows up here is that, again, we take a trip that, say we get on at Solana Beach and we're going to get off at Old Town. And right now, if we're on our coaster all stop, that takes us 31 minutes. If we're on an Amtrak, 32. And so you can see with the Charger, with the Torrey Pines and UTC alignment, some significant time savings and additional savings with a zero emission. And you can see a similar trend with the limited stop or the Surfliner. Next slide. We took that same evaluation criteria I mentioned, the same weights, and we applied them to these, the two alternatives here, Miramar. And you can see just a slight nod with the UTC alignment. We're not recommending that we drop either of these alignments at this point. It's a little too early in our study. So we'll continue to carry forward both of these alignments into more study. Next slide. And this also, just to give you a kind of a summary as we know it right now in terms of some of the key issue areas. First is cost, and you can see a little bit higher cost with the UTC alignment, a little bit longer, although the tunnel length is shorter and not as deep as a Torrey Pines alignment. And you can see the amount of elevated structure that we propose at this level of study. So with that, next slide, please. I would like to turn things over to Mark Ramsey, and he can run through some of the tunneling details.
Thank you, Linda. You could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So in the tunneling and fire life safety, I'm going to mainly focus on the tunneling considerations, including the configurations that we've studied, as well as tunnels in similar ground conditions. And then we'll talk about the fire life safety or FLS considerations. And the two main considerations that we'll be discussing today are egress and ventilation. Next slide. So the first of the tunnel configurations that I'd like to discuss is a single bore option. This is a larger diameter tunnel with both trains in the same tunnel. The picture on the left-hand side is a concept where both trains are separated by a firewall, and then there's the safety walk in between. And then there's other configurations like the upper right where there's no dividing wall, and then the bottom right where it's an over and under configuration. Next slide. The twin bore configuration is a very standard, very traditional approach to subways and transit on multiple agencies all over the world. The tunnels are separated by typically a minimum of a tunnel diameter in between the two tunnels. And then there's cross passages, and I'll talk a little bit more about cross passages later, but cross passages in between the two tunnels for egress and for operations as well. Next slide. There is a triple bore concept, and this is very limited in use. It's typically used where the tunnels are longer and there's very little access from the surface to the tunnels. This was used on the Channel Tunnel, which is between England and France. The tunnel is approximately 30 miles long, and obviously since it's under the English Channel, there's very little access from above. So that center tunnel is a service tunnel. It can be used for maintenance, egress, both for firefighters or first responders or for people trying to get out. And it also can be used for ventilation. Next slide, please. So tunnels in similar ground conditions, there are several listed here, two of them in San Diego. The Mission Valley East Tunnel is for MTS underneath San Diego State University. Courthouse Commons is downtown. The excavation just finished up in the last week or so. Regional connector is for LA Metro downtown Los Angeles. Channel Tunnel, which I mentioned earlier. Alaskan Way Viaduct up in Seattle. Completed excavation about a year or two ago, and it was at the time the largest soft ground tunnel boring machine in the world, just over 57 feet in diameter. It was eclipsed after that by a few inches by a tunnel in Hong Kong. Next slide, please. We all like pictures of projects, so here's some pictures of some of these projects. The one in the left is the Alaskan Way Viaduct, and that says the TBM is finishing its excavation. The middle is the Mission Valley East, and the one on the right is Regional Connector in Los Angeles. Next slide. So it's important to understand the reasons for egress when we're talking about the fire life safety egress approaches and means. So first of all, escaping from a train. If there's a fire on the train or in the tunnel, patrons would have to escape from the train. So that would be one main reason for egress. For subway systems and light rail systems, the trains are electrically powered. So if the power were to go out, you'd have to leave the train for that. And then if there's a derailment or a train breakdown, there would be other reasons for egress. Next slide. So what are some of the means of egress? I mentioned cross passages earlier. The picture on the left is one side of a twin bore tunnel approach, and there would be a doorway along this walkway. The walkway is on the right-hand side of this picture. So patrons would get out of the train onto the walkway, go to the nearest cross passage. The cross passage is simply a door with a mined excavation in between the two tunnels. Walk through that excavation, through the door, and then you're in the non-incident tunnel. And from there, you could either walk to the nearest exit to the surface or wait for a rescue train. And that would all depend on the operations and maintenance approach to the tunneling. Oh, sorry, could you go back one? I'm sorry. So NFPA does allow to have an exit to the surface in lieu of having cross passages. The NFPA requires cross passages at every 800 feet or an exit to the surface every 2,500 feet, not both. So it's an or statement. So, and that will be up to the agency operating the tunnels to decide which of the means of egress would be better suited for their operations. And then the walkways, and then of course there's going to be emergency signage and markings within the tunnels as well. Next slide, please. Ventilation, obviously something very important for fire life safety as well. And some of these are the reasons for the need for the ventilation systems in the tunnel. The tunnels, the ventilation system doesn't normally operate. So the tunnels do have a tendency to heat up. So when it reaches a certain temperature, the ventilation system would turn on and exhaust the heat. With diesel locomotives, we would need to decrease the amount of carbon, or not carbon, but nitrogen dioxide, so exhaust from the diesel. So there'd be, the ventilation would kick on for that. If there were a fire on the train or in the tunnel, you would control the smoke with the use of ventilation systems. And then the NFPA requires ventilation systems for any tunnel that's longer than 1,000 feet. Next slide. This is an example of a typical emergency ventilation system fan. This is about 6 to 8 feet in diameter. And then the square metal blocks at either end are sound attenuators, just to cut down some of the noise that the fans would put out. Next slide. Next slide. So talk a little bit about tunnels with similar operations. Meaning tunnels that have commuter and freight in the same tunnel, and then also some of the operations and maintenance considerations for rail tunnels. Next slide. The list on the left are US-based tunnels that have freight and commuter in the same tunnel. They are kind of all over the place. There are several on the West Coast as well. And then the ones on the right are international tunnels. These are all fairly recently constructed and recently put in place. The Brenner Pass Tunnel actually is still under construction. They're very long, and they are accommodating high-speed freight and commuter rail. The Channel Tunnel, like I mentioned earlier, is about 30 miles long. Goddard Base Tunnel is 57 kilometers. Brenner Pass, I think, is just over 60 kilometers. Will be the longest rail tunnel in the world. And Lochberg Tunnel is fairly long as well in Switzerland. Next slide. So some of the key operations considerations for rail tunnels: the lighting system has to operate. So the operating lighting system, the lighting technology has come a long way recently. So they're using LED lights in tunnels now to cut down on the power usage. The fans, like I mentioned earlier, would have to operate, whether to be exhausting temperature or pollutants or for emergency systems. And then operating pumps for track drainage to get the water back out of the tunnels into the surface sewer systems. Some of the maintenance considerations: tunnels do have a tendency to leak. From time to time, the maintenance would have to go in to seal those leaks up or to prevent them from damaging any of the track or the train controller systems. And then maintaining track and checking and maintaining the train control and other systems within the tunnel are also maintenance considerations. Next slide. Thank you, Linda.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Just a couple last points to make. One is in terms of the study schedule. So we have some of those kind of basic building block documents. We went through the operational feasibility, some of the basis of design. We'll have those finalized this summer. We'll have the Del Mar Tunnel alternatives analysis finished up this summer and the Miramar Hill right after that. And then we are going to turn attention to the entire corridor, to the rest of the 60-mile corridor in San Diego, and look at additional improvements that could reduce travel times. And then we'll end up about this time next year. We'll have all of it wrapped up. We'll have cost estimates, operations and maintenance estimates for the tunnel projects, phasing and implementation. In future phases of development, for example, an environmental phase on any of these improvements are still pending funding. Next slide. You had a few key planning considerations that were listed in the staff report. I think some of these we've covered. I just might mention a couple of things in ending the presentation. Is one, on the first bullet, we're wondering about the impact of the proposed realignments on projects that are currently planned. And one example was the San Diego Bridge. And that project is in final design. That would replace the wooden bridge with a new double track bridge and have platforms for the seasonal service. Really the only one of the Del Mar alignments that had any impact on the south end of the bridge is the I-5 alignment, just having to kind of head due east very quickly off of that bridge. All the other alignments would not impact that bridge, for example. And Mark covered the fire life safety and some of the operating requirements. We will have operations and maintenance costs I mentioned a little bit later. We don't quite have those finished, but now we have narrowed the list to a couple. We're able to put those together. And then I mentioned a timeline to complete the study, and that we'll have everything wrapped up in about a year. However, we are continuing to look for funding for the future phases of any of this work. We've also, as NCTD has been, we've been working with Congressman Levin's office, for example, for some additional funding that could get, depending on the amount, could get us into an environmental process for one of these projects. So we appreciate the extra time, a little bit lengthy presentation today, but thank you for your questions so far, and we're happy to take any additional questions or comments that you have.
Okay, thank you. Board member, Vice Chair Edson.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Hamish. Thank you, Mark. So I think my first question is for Linda. Linda, are the ZMUs suitable for freight use?
Are the VMUs?
The ZMUs, yes.
Oh, the ZMUs. I believe those are more passenger. Hamish can help me or Tillman. But I think the comment we've received from BNSF is they are looking at a zero emission locomotive in the future for their service.
Thanks. And you mentioned that there were different lengths of elevated structures. Can you tell me, say for the top 2 Del Mar tunnel alternatives, what the locations of those elevated structures might be?
I think we will have that for the alternatives analysis. For right now, just in general would be approaching each of the tunnel portals. So it could be in Los Penasquitos Lagoon, for example, could be in San Dieguito Lagoon, for example.
Okay, so through the lagoons.
It could be, yeah. We'll have that tightened up for the AA report.
And the Torrey Pines alignment, is there a station or a stop planned that would have it connect with Midcoast Trolley? Because, obviously UTC would, but Torrey Pines?
Yeah, we are looking at somewhere in the area of the Nobel Drive station. I think the team needs to continue to flesh that out, but we saw that as an important connection, and that might be one option for a connection. Okay, and I think next is for Mark. Slide 101 talked about tunnels in similar ground conditions and mentioned a couple, at least one, I thought 2 in San Diego area. My question is relative length of those tunnels compared to what we're looking at for both Del Mar and for the Mira Mesa tunnel, or the Del Mar Torrey Mesa tunnel.
Good question. The Courthouse Commons tunnel is fairly short. I believe it's about 150 feet long. It's excavated with a little bit different tunneling technique as well. And the Mission Valley East was the different tunneling technique as well, and it was a little bit longest. I think it was in the 4,000 foot range, so it was a little under a mile. But the ground conditions versus the length is not all that important in tunneling. As long as you're able to get the design right and the excavation method right, you can really kind of extrapolate out to longer leaks of tunnels.
And then you had a slide on the ventilation fans, and please remind me what the length of tunnel, what the requirement is for ventilation fans with the
1,000 feet.
And the tunnels that we're proposing, or you're proposing, or we're studying?
The Del Mar range from 1.8 to, I believe, 2.5. And Miramar, Torrey Pines are a little bit longer than that. So yes, it would definitely require ventilation, and that's something that we'll be studying as we go forward with the conceptual engineering. Right now, we're proposing that the ventilation be mainly at the portals. So the fans would be at the port. There'd be ventilation structures at the portals, and trying to make those as unobtrusive to the neighborhoods as possible, the community as possible. Instead of having, there's some agencies that have midpoint vent shafts, and I don't think these alignments would be very suited for midpoint vent shafts based on their location in the area.
And those portals were the X's that were on those different tunnel.
Yes,
right? Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
And study schedule, we've got a year to get to this study wrapped up, approximately. No one's holding you to that one. Then, Linda, I think you mentioned beyond that, doing environmental study. Would that be the last thing that would need to be done in order to get to the time that, say, we could break ground?
No, we'd need to do preliminary engineering in support of that environmental document, environmentally clear whatever project it might be, and then finish final design. So get to 100% design, and that would make it ready to be advertised for construction.
And how long would you estimate, just as a ballpark, to get to that point?
We think, and it's all pending funding, and that's a big, a big statement to start with. But pending funding, perhaps, 3 to 5 years through environmental, another year for final design, something like that. So around 5 years or so to
And
get
then-
to that point.
And then is there an estimate for the length of time it might take for construction?
I think just at this very high level, we have discussed internally another 5 years or so for the construction part. It really depends on which project it is, but that's just a general.
Okay, and just one last question. Tunnel configurations, there was twin bore and triple bore. The triple bores seem to be much longer tunnels. Is there anything that you're leaning toward being most suitable?
Mark,
Right
Anna?
now, we think the twin bore is the most suitable.
I have new questions every time I hear this, and
That's
thank you
good.
for-
That's
good.
great.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Board Member Quirk.
Great, thank you. I guess I have a comment. First of all, that these are major projects. I mean, they're huge projects. And then my second one is, can you explain to me what elevated structure means for Del Mar? I think it was 8,000 feet for one of the proposals. So I guess I'm not understanding what that means, beyond the actual tunnel length, which I think 2.5 miles was one of the ones.
That would be the tracks on a structure elevated. It would not be at grade. There'd be a bridge, for example, would be one example.
So,
Something above grade.
but with the Del Mar one, there's 8,000 feet. So I think there's 8,000 feet of elevated structure in addition to the tunnel themselves or itself.
Correct. Depending on the alternative.
Okay, so 8,000 feet, that's a mile and a half or so. Okay, I guess I'm not quite understanding what that is or what that looks like.
Right. Well, so yeah, we don't have any photographs of that, but to get into and out of the tunnel, depending on where that portal is, might require the track to be elevated on a structure. So for example, if you're coming south and you go through the tunnel, a tunnel alignment, and you're in Los Penasquitos Lagoon, then very likely that segment of track for some distance would be elevated above the lagoon. So it'd be up on a structure above grade.
Okay, got it.
And following up on that question, when we did the Los Penasquitos bridge work, there was some talk about sea level rise and whether we should elevate the structure through that lagoon at the time. And because it was state of good repair, we stuck with the essentially ballast on grade that had been 130 years old that was put through that lagoon. So essentially what you're talking about is elevating the tracks essentially all the way across the lagoons. Is that a safe way to describe it?
Yes, that's a safe way, depending on
Okay.
the alignment. Mhm.
Okay. Thank you. Is that it, Dan?
Yes, for now, thank you.
All right, Board Member Jenkins.
I don't know if this is known at this point in time, but approximately how many properties with homes on them would be affected by something like this? Are we talking hundreds? And then the next question is, how is that calculated into the cost when you don't know what your purchasing price might be of those properties?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And the short answer of it is we do not know at this time. We're very high level with our work on the alignments, but it's certainly something that will be known as we get to, for example, into an environmental process. We'll do more right-of-way analysis. We'll do more, technical studies in support of that. So we just don't know that answer right now.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. I think that one of the well, first off, what is it environmentally about the Camino del Mar alignment that has a significant impact on the environment? Why is that low score on that?
Yeah, that's related to that the technical evaluation from the project team, and it was the team's opinion that perhaps relative to some of those other alternatives, that might should score a little bit lower. I think one of the comments on Camino del Mar was perhaps related to the Los Penasquitos Lagoon on the south end of that tunnel, and we may have scored that a little lower than some of the other alternatives.
So it doesn't have anything to do with the geology or such, or perhaps because it's not as deep, maybe there are some property owners that are impacted in a greater way. Are these possible factors?
Well, we haven't done all of those technical studies yet, but the technical evaluation was from the project development team, and some of us may have had some of that information in mind as we rated them. It was a kind of a group rating. So it was just kind of what we felt at the time, that list of agencies that you saw from the PDT, what we felt for each of the alternatives at this time.
So it's somewhat subjective at this point. It's the next phase of the analysis that we're going to get a little more technical and perhaps refine some of the scoring. Is that what you're thinking?
Well, I think we'll use the scoring as a tool. We have a number of tools. We have the technical team, we have the evaluation criteria, we have public outreach. And then once we get a project into more of the environmental phase, that's when we'll be doing all those detailed technical studies to answer a lot of these questions. So not quite there yet, but it is, the evaluation was one tool that we used in terms of narrowing down the alternatives.
And do you have a rough estimate of what the environmental analysis of this project will cost?
Well, we have a rough calculation. It's just purely at this point based on like a percentage of the total. So if a tunnel is $2 billion, we'd estimate about $80 million to $100 million for preliminary engineering, a 30% engineering look in environmental. But we will have a better cost, Chair Kranz, later on this summer when we do the alternatives analysis report.
Okay, and then the final point, I've been involved, in some of these more recent conversations about tunneling. I know tunneling and the proposal to tunnel through Del Mar has been around for a long time, 15 years or so. It's part of the RTP. And I think that there was some sticker shock back when the initial conversations was being held, and it kind of went, it wasn't a high priority. And recently we've been seeing some of the bluff collapses, and we recognize now, I think everybody in the region as well as at the state, that this has got to have a higher sense of urgency. So NCTD has been working pretty hard to move people in the direction of stabilizing the bluff in order to buy time to do this analysis and then raise the revenue to actually construct a project. And so a 5 to 6 year time frame, or 3 to 5 year time frame for just the analysis and engineering is a clearer indication that our focus on stabilizing the bluffs is critical, and that we need to continue to do that. And then Secretary Kim, the Transportation Secretary in Sacramento, pointed out that in LA, the tunnel work that's been going on is, I think, on its 7th year. So construction of the tunneling, to do the tunneling, is going to take a significant amount of time. So before a train could run through a new tunnel, we'll have to raise a bunch of revenue, and then many years will go by. So I think for this board, it's important to recognize that a focus on stabilizing the bluffs for an extended period of time is very important. So I guess that wasn't much of a question, but it was more of a comment. And I see Board Member Quirk's hand is back up. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you, Tony. So we have 2 tunnels here, Del Mar and Miramar. Would the idea be to present them as a package, or would they be considered each on their own merits?
That's a great question. And I think it's also an environmental question. And I think the way we're thinking of it at this time, at this high level, is 2 separate projects.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, I see no more hands raised. Mr. Tucker, did you have any comments you wanted to make?
As part of my executive director's report of this item?
This item?
No, sir.
No, sir, you coward. Okay, let's see.
Chair Krantz,
Thank
just
you
a
to the
reminder,
Sandag.
I'm sorry, sir. Just a reminder, we have 2 public comments for this item.
Okay, I would like to hear those public comments. I think they're by way of recorded telephone calls.
Yes, sir.
Okay, play them, please.
My name is Dr. Udo Wong, 1227 Stratford Court, Del Mar, resident for 38 years, submitting public comment on item number 12, 4/22/2021. I support the realignment of the train tracks off the bluffs. The catastrophic bluff failure would threaten lives and cause severe economic impacts on transportation, commerce, tourism, telecommunications, air quality, and military readiness. Sandag ran a cost-benefit analysis of what it would take to repair the impacts of a 400-foot-long collapse, estimated at astonishing $310 million over 1 year. One bluff failure was only about 10 feet away from the tracks. It is very urgent that the bluffs are stabilized now in such a way as to consider environmental impacts, and it is critical that the train tracks are moved off the bluffs as soon as possible. I would like to comment also about the idea floated to build seawalls at the base of the bluffs all along the entire Del Mar shoreline from Powerhouse Park to Torrey Pines State Reserve, and to decapitate the bluff top from 8th Street to 11th. This is sheer madness and an assault on the sensitive environment. The precious tidal zone is alive with unique flora and fauna that would be destroyed. This cannot be allowed. Geologist Dr. Patrick Abbott spoke after a lethal bluff collapse, saying, "Seawalls only delay the inevitable." He noted that erosion would still be occurring behind seawall as a result of rain and irrigation water seeping through the sandstone. Considering all the interests that are affected by what happens on the bluffs, I believe strongly that funding should come from all levels of government, including the military. Let's put President Biden's infrastructure funding plan to work here and now. During the stabilization and also afterwards, the public will want to have at-grade access at multiple locations to cross the tracks and to be able to get to the beach. Fencing off the bluffs is simply not acceptable. Consider this from a recent Bloomberg Business Week article. Elon Musk's boring company's goal is to dig 7 miles in a day, compared to older tunneling technology yielding 1 mile in 12 weeks. And this recently from Teslarati. The boring company is hard at work developing next generation all-electric tunnel boring machine that's designed to be capable of digging 1 mile per week, or about 6 times faster than what is now used. The author writes that the machines such as this and the incredible low cost of its tunnels are the boring company's true disruption. I would not bet against Elon Musk. Let's get his company on the case. Please join Sandag, many of our political leaders, the City of Del Mar Council, and members of the public in publicly affirming the need to move the rail off the bluffs so that we can avoid the worst impacts of stabilization. Thank you.
And we have one more, sir.
Hi, Chair and Board. This is Noah Harris with Climate Action Campaign, calling to comment on item 12 of the April 22nd board agenda. We urge NCTV to commit today to moving the lift and tracks off the Del Mar Bluffs as soon as possible. We thank Sandag for working to identify alternative alignments through this corridor improvement study that will increase travel time and safety. Currently, the 1.6 mile stretch of tracks in Del Mar is located dangerously close to the edge of the bluff, and several bluff failures within feet of the tracks have occurred over the past couple of years. With the bluffs eroding at approximately 6 inches per year and the ever-intensifying threat of sea level rise due to the climate crisis, these incredibly dangerous bluff failures will only increase in severity and frequency, putting lives seriously at risk. We need a transportation system that is climate safe and climate ready. Moving the tracks off the bluffs is essential to securing a long-term solution for the low sand corridor, all while reducing greenhouse gas emissions, especially with zero emission vehicles, preventing increased air pollution from trucks, and ensuring economic prosperity for the region. Thank you.
That concludes all the telephonic comments, sir. Other written comments were provided to the board prior to the meeting.
Okay, thank you, Linda and Mark and Hamish for your presentation. I know you have a whole lot of work ahead of you, and so good luck with all of that.
Thank you.
Moving on to the executive director's report. Mr. Tucker, do you have anything for us today?
Yeah, I will just share something quickly. We are working with our contractor MV Transportation on Breeze bus operator staffing. One of the things I just wanted to share with the board proactively is that there is a shortage of employees on the bus system. It's an emerging trend going throughout the industry. There was a recent article identifying that LA Metro needed to hire about 800 employees. We are working with them closely to advance as much hiring as we can. We are hopeful that as benefits associated with unemployment are reduced in August, that we will see more and more folks attempt to return to work. We have about 15 employees out, various short-term and long-term different issues. But I think there are going to be some potential near-term impacts to loss of service as we go through this process of rehiring approximately 38 to 40 new bus operators. So I just wanted to share that proactively with you all. That concludes my report.
What is the starting wage for a coach operator?
I believe it's close to $17 an hour. It's $16.40, 32 cents to start.
And these are full-time jobs?
Yes, and these are trainee. That's the trainee starting rate. It goes up after the employee has completed training. This was also something we just adjusted in our contract negotiations. Well, we didn't, but MV, with strong support from NCTD, made significant adjustments to pay and to benefits for this contract that was just agreed upon that's going to last 5 years. So we improved significantly wages on the front end for employees, and we are implementing over the 3 to 5 years an 80-20 percentage share on healthcare. So we've made some significant moves. There may be some additional moves that we will have to make in terms of hiring incentives to support this transitionary period.
Okay, thank you. Any board members have anything that they would like to report? Okay, Board Member Jenkins, Vice Chair Jenkins.
I just have a quick question. Matt, when do you anticipate making a recommendation as to if we're going to go back to in-person meetings, or when the possible timing of that might be, or if we plan to stay like this?
Oh, I plan to consult, and we've already started that process with the chair and vice chair. We probably will have a discussion at the executive committee and get direction from a staff point of view. I view it really as something that the board needs to provide direction to staff on.
Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Board Member Sanchez.
Thank you. Yes, I was going to ask the same question. We have been meeting throughout COVID in person at council chambers 6 feet apart with masks. And last night we had our first council meeting with chambers open to the public with 6 feet apart in the chambers. So I think we were able to accommodate up to 25, 26 people. So that was what I was going to ask too, is what the process is going to be moving forward as to in-person meetings. Thank you.
Well, we'll have to see. We're going to talk about it. The bunker is not a great place for air circulation and 6 feet of separation. So maybe we should be working with the city of Oceanside to use their chambers again, like we did in the past. But we'll be talking about it and get back to in person just as soon as feasible. I know it's a little better. So with that. I would say, Anthony, do we have any remaining public comments?
We do not, sir.
All right. So on this Earth Day, remember we're engaged in business in an effort to reduce vehicle miles traveled so that our Mother Earth can perhaps sustain life of human beings for a little bit longer. So let's keep up that work. And we are adjourned to the next scheduled meetings, which is scheduled for May 20, 2021 at 2 p.m. with a PAF committee meeting on May 6th of 2021 at 1:30. Thank you. We are adjourned.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.